In the beginning, there were gods. They ruled from marble thrones and golden halls, dispensing justice and wrath in equal measure, while mortals below worshipped their power and feared their displeasure. Among them walked Kratos, first as servant, then as slayer, carrying the weight of divine authority and the corruption it inevitably brought. But gods, like mortals, can die, and when they do, their power must go somewhere. This is the story of what happens when that power chooses service over dominion, when divine authority learns to kneel before human bonds, and when a child born into hatred discovers that the greatest strength lies not in what you can destroy, but in what you choose to protect. It is the story of Naruto Uzumaki, who inherited the rage of a god-slayer and chose to forge it into something the world had never seen. Divine power that serves rather than rules, strength that builds rather than breaks, authority that lifts others instead of crushing them beneath its weight. In the hidden village of Konoha, where shadows dance with secrets and children learn to kill before they learn to love, one boy will discover that the chains which once bound gods can also protect the innocent. He will learn that true power comes not from the ability to dominate, but from the wisdom to restrain oneself for the sake of others. This is his legacy. This is his choice. This is the story of how a god learned to be human, and how humanity learned that even gods can serve something greater than themselves. The age of divine tyranny is ending. The age of divine service has begun. Let the story unfold.
The chains sang their ancient song again. Naruto jolted upright in his narrow academy dormitory bed, heart hammering against his ribs like a caged beast. The dream clung to him with spectral fingers, heavy iron links that rattled with a specific frequency that made his teeth ache, volcanic ash coating his tongue with the taste of metal and death, and somewhere in the suffocating darkness, a child's voice crying out in anguish. "Father, Father!" the word echoed in his skull, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his 7-year-old understanding of the world. His fingers trembled as he reached up to touch his cheeks, expecting tears but finding instead the faint, impossible residue of ash between his fingertips. Third time this week, he thought, wiping his hands on the thin blanket. The dormitory around him was silent except for his own ragged breathing. Through the small window, Konoha slept peacefully under a canopy of stars, blissfully unaware that something ancient and terrible was stirring in the vessel of their most despised child. Naruto swung his legs over the side of the bed, bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The nightmare had left him with more than just phantom ash and the echo of chains. There was a pressure building behind his eyes, a golden warmth that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. When he closed his eyes and concentrated, he could almost see threads of light dancing beneath his skin. What's happening to me? The question had haunted him for weeks now, ever since the dreams began, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the warmth felt expectant, as if it were waiting for something. He didn't have long to wait. The morning of October 10th dawned gray and unwelcoming, matching the mood that seemed to settle over Konoha like a funeral shroud. Naruto had learned to dread this date, the anniversary of the Kyuubi's attack, the day when the village's simmering hatred toward him boiled over into something uglier. But he still needed to eat. The market district buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as vendors set up their stalls and early shoppers hurried through their errands. Naruto kept his head down, clutching the small bundle of coins he'd saved from his monthly stipend. Just a few groceries in and out, maybe this year would be different. Maybe, well, look what crawled out of its hole. Naruto's steps faltered. Hayato the blacksmith stood blocking his path, arms crossed over his broad chest. At 34, the man was built like the weapons he forged, hard, unforgiving, and sharp around the edges. Behind him, a small crowd was already gathering, drawn by the promise of entertainment. "I don't want any trouble," Naruto said quietly, trying to step around the larger man. Hayato's hand shot out, fingers digging into Naruto's shoulder with enough force to leave bruises. 67 pounds of pressure, though Naruto wouldn't understand the significance of that measurement until much later. "Trouble, you are the trouble demon. Today of all days, you should have the decency to stay hidden." The pressure behind Naruto's eyes spiked. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways, and he could swear he heard the distant sound of chains rattling in the wind. The golden warmth in his chest pulsed once, twice, no. The thought came from somewhere deeper than his conscious mind, carrying the weight of eons and the bitter wisdom of gods who had learned too late the price of unchecked power. Not like this, not in anger. But the divine energy building in his small frame had momentum now, and 7-year-old restraint could only do so much. What happened next took 0.31 seconds. To the observers, it looked like nothing at all. One moment Hayato was gripping Naruto's shoulder, sneering down at the blonde child. The next, he was stumbling backward with a sharp cry of pain, cradling his right arm against his chest. "My arm," Hayato gasped, his face going pale. "Something, it feels like it's broken." Naruto stared at his own hands in horror. He hadn't moved. He was certain he hadn't moved. But the warmth in his chest had flared for an instant. And now Hayato was hurt, and everyone was looking at him with a mixture of fear and hatred that made his stomach turn. I wasn't, demon," someone screamed from the crowd. "It attacked him without even touching him. Get away from it. Someone call the Anbu." The world began to spin. The golden warmth was spreading through his body now, uncontrolled and terrifying. Naruto doubled over as his chakra coils began to scorch from the inside out, the divine energy burning through pathways that were never meant to carry such power. His vision blurred as his core temperature plummeted, and his hands began to shake with fine tremors. Then he was vomiting in the street, his small body rejecting the alien energy that had no business existing in a 7-year-old child. The crowd pressed closer, their voices a cacophony of fear and accusation, and Naruto wanted nothing more than to disappear into the ground. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a figure in an Anbu mask crouching beside him. The mask was painted to resemble a crow, and behind the eyeholes, Naruto caught a glimpse of red, sharing eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "Easy," the Anbu said quietly, his voice muffled by the mask. "You're going to be okay." Strong arms lifted him from the street, and Naruto's last coherent thought before unconsciousness claimed him was that the stranger smelled like smoke and sadness, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like grinding stone whispered a single word. Sparta, the academy infirmary, was a place Naruto had visited more times than he cared to count, usually after some accident that left him bruised and bleeding, but unable to prove who had done it. But he had never been unconscious when he arrived, and he had never woken up to find the third Hokage sitting beside his bed with an expression of deep concern etched into his weathered features. "How do you feel, Naruto?" Hiruzen asked gently, setting aside a scroll covered in complex sealing formulas. Naruto took inventory of his body. The golden warmth was gone, leaving behind an ache that seemed to extend all the way to his bones. His head pounded with every heartbeat and his mouth tasted like copper and ash. But more than that, he felt different. As if something fundamental had shifted inside him. "Like I got stepped on by a really big horse," he admitted. Hiruzen's mouth twitched upward despite the gravity of the situation. "That's not entirely inaccurate. Naruto, I need to ask you some questions about what happened in the market. Do you remember?" The memories came flooding back, Hayato's hand on his shoulder, the surge of alien power, the man's cry of pain. Naruto's stomach clenched with guilt and fear. "I didn't mean to hurt him," he said quickly. "I don't know what happened. I was just angry, and then there was this feeling, and I believe you," Hiruzen said, cutting off his rambling explanation. "But I need you to understand that something very unusual happened today, something that could be dangerous if we don't learn to control it." "Dangerous how?" Naruto asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The Hokage was quiet for a long moment, studying the boy with eyes that had seen too much in their long years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult truths. "Power, Naruto, is like fire. In the right hands, it can warm a home, cook a meal, forge a blade that protects the innocent. But uncontrolled." He gestured to the scroll beside the bed, its sealing formulas glowing faintly in the lamplight. "Uncontrolled, it can burn down everything you hold dear." Naruto stared at the scroll, recognizing some of the simpler symbols from his academy classes, but unable to read the complex matrix as a whole. "What kind of power? The kind that heroes are born from," Hiruzen said simply, "and the kind that destroys them if they're not careful." He reached out and placed a gentle hand on Naruto's forehead. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we begin your education in control. And Naruto, yes, Hokage. This power, whatever it is, wherever it came from, it chose you. That makes it your responsibility, not your burden, your responsibility. There's a difference, and learning that difference may be the most important lesson of your life." As the old man left the infirmary, Naruto lay back against his pillow and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, night was falling over Konoha, and in the distance, he could hear the sounds of the KUB festival, laughter and music, and the carefree voices of people who didn't carry the weight of impossible power in their small bodies. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the dreams were waiting for him. Dreams of chains and ash, of a man with scars covering his body and rage burning in his eyes, of a small girl with dark hair who called him father in a voice full of love and trust. And underneath it all, patient as the grave and inevitable as sunrise, a power that whispered of gods and the terrible price of defying them. Naruto didn't know it yet, but his childhood had just ended. And somewhere in the deepest vault of his mind, Kratos the God-Slayer stirred in his prison of flesh and bone, and smiled. 2 weeks after the market incident, Naruto stood in the academy training yard wearing what Iruka-sensei had cheerfully described as conditioning equipment. The suppression seals disguised as training weights felt heavier this morning, their microscopic formulas pulsing against his skin in rhythm with his heartbeat. At 10 years old, he'd grown accustomed to their presence, but the golden warmth beneath still stirred restlessly, like a caged animal testing the bars of its prison. "Remember your breathing, Naruto," Iruka called from across the sparring circle. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Keep your partner's safety in mind." Naruto nodded, settling into the ready stance opposite Kiba Inuzuka. The technique had become second nature over the past weeks. Breathe in for 4 heartbeats while scanning for his opponent's weak points. Breathe out for 6 while consciously choosing restraint over precision strikes. It was a delicate balance, made more complex by the fact that his classmates had no idea he was holding back enough force to put them in the hospital. "Begin," Iruka shouted. Kiba lunged forward with Akamaru at his side, both moving in the coordinated assault pattern their clan was famous for. But to Naruto's enhanced perception, they might as well have been moving through honey. His reaction time had improved by roughly 20% since the divine energy awakened, and every instinct screamed at him to target the pressure point just below Kiba's left shoulder, or to redirect Akamaru's trajectory into the academy wall. Instead, he blocked conventionally and allowed Kiba to score a point. "Good match," Iruka said, making notes on his clipboard, but Naruto caught the instructor's subtle frown, the same expression he'd worn for weeks now as he watched his most unpredictable student demonstrate impossible restraint and tactical awareness that bordered on the supernatural. After class, Naruto lingered behind as the other students filtered out, chattering about weekend plans and upcoming festivals. Through the academy windows, he could see Anbu operatives moving through the village in casual clothes, a street vendor here, a maintenance worker there. The sunlight protocol had been active for exactly 14 days now, though most civilians assumed they were simply seeing more civic engagement from their local government. "Naruto," Iruka said quietly, approaching with 2 cups of tea. "How are you feeling today? Any unusual sensations?" It was the same question every day, asked with the same careful tone that suggested Iruka knew far more about his condition than he let on. Naruto accepted the tea gratefully, noting how his instructor's hands didn't shake anymore when they came in proximity. 2 weeks of breathing exercises had helped them both. "The weights feel different today," Naruto admitted. "Looser somehow," Iruka's expression tightened. The suppression seals were designed with gradual slippage. As Naruto's control improved, they would naturally reduce their restriction. But if they were loosening ahead of schedule? A soft knock at the classroom door interrupted his thoughts. Iruka-sensei, Hinata Hyuga stood in the doorway, her pale lavender eyes focused intently on Naruto's seated form. Even from across the room, she could see the golden threads that wound through his chakra network like veins of liquid sunlight, and today they seemed brighter than usual. "Hinata-chan," Iruka said with forced casualness. "Did you forget something in class?" She hesitated, then stepped into the room with the careful grace that marked all Hyuga clan members. "I wanted to ask Naruto-kun about the breathing technique. My father says it could be useful for our clan training." It wasn't entirely a lie. Hiashi had indeed expressed interest in the breath synchronization methods, though more for their applications in divine energy management than traditional gentle fist training. But what Hinata didn't mention was that her Byakugan could see the subtle fluctuations in Naruto's golden aura, and that those fluctuations had been growing stronger all week. "That's a great idea," Iruka said, though his tone suggested he understood far more than his words implied. "Why don't you two practice together? I need to file today's reports with the administration." As their instructor gathered his papers and left the classroom, an uncomfortable silence settled between the two students. Naruto fidgeted with his teacup, while Hinata seemed to study something just over his left shoulder, which he realized was probably exactly where his divine energy was most visible to her unique sight. "Can you really see it?" he asked finally. Hinata started slightly, then nodded. "Golden threads," she said softly. "They move differently today, more active." "Is that bad?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But my father says that when chakra patterns change suddenly, it usually means something important is about to happen." She was right, though neither of them would understand just how right until later that evening. The attack came at 9:30 p.m., just as Mrs. Yamamoto was making her way home from visiting her daughter's family. The elderly woman had taken the long route through the Memorial District, as she often did when she wanted to remember her husband who had died defending the village during the Third War. She was completely unaware of the three figures moving through the shadows around her, or of the 10-year-old boy who had been making his monthly pilgrimage to read names carved in stone. Naruto had been kneeling before the memorial for nearly an hour, running his fingers over the characters that marked his parents' resting place and wondering if they would have been proud or terrified of what he was becoming. The breathing exercises helped quiet his mind, and the cool night air made it easier to ignore the pressure building behind his eyes. Then he heard Mrs. Yamamoto cry out in alarm. Three figures in gray masks had materialized around the elderly woman, one crouched on a nearby rooftop, one blocking her path forward, and one approaching from behind with deliberate, measured steps. Root operatives, Naruto realized with a chill, though he wouldn't learn that designation for several more years. "Please," Mrs. Yamamoto was saying, clutching her bag of groceries against her chest. "I'm just trying to get home. I don't have anything valuable." The operative behind her moved with liquid precision, drawing a tanto that gleamed silver in the moonlight. But he wasn't aiming for the old woman. His target was the boy who was already rising from his kneeling position at the memorial, divine energy beginning to flare around him like heat shimmer. Test the defensive capabilities, Bear thought as he initiated the assault. Danzo wants to know how much power the Jinchuriki can actually access. What happened next would be analyzed in Anbu reports for months afterward. The spectral chains manifested in 2.1 seconds of stable manifestation, longer than any previous incident and far more controlled. The first chain intercepted the tanto aimed at Mrs. Yamamoto's back, striking the operative's wrist with surgical precision that disarmed without breaking bone. The second wrapped around the rooftop operative's ankles, disrupting his balance and preventing him from launching thrown weapons into the engagement zone. The third formed a protective barrier between Mrs. Yamamoto and the operative, blocking her path, its translucent golden surface solid enough to deflect the shuriken that followed. But the cost was immediate and devastating. Naruto collapsed to his knees as his chakra coils began to scorch from the inside, the divine energy burning through pathways that were still developing in his 10-year-old body. His vision blurred as his core temperature dropped and fine tremors began in his dominant hand. "Golden ropes," Mrs. Yamamoto whispered in awe, staring at the fading constructs that had saved her life. They were golden ropes that moved like they were alive. 43 seconds later, Team 7 Anbu arrived on scene with Kakashi in the lead. The silver-haired Jonin took in the situation at a glance, 3 root operatives in tactical positions, 1 elderly civilian in shock, and 1 10-year-old boy barely conscious from divine energy overexertion. "Secure the operatives," Kakashi ordered his team. "I'll handle the civilian and the asset." As Tenzo and Yugao moved to apprehend the captured root agents, Kakashi knelt beside Naruto with practiced efficiency. The boy's pulse was elevated but stable, and his breathing showed the controlled rhythm that Iruka had been teaching him. Good, the training was holding even under extreme stress. "Mrs. Yamamoto," Kakashi said gently, turning to the elderly woman. "You're safe now, but I need you to come with us so we can make sure you're not injured." The memory modification was performed with the newer, more ethical techniques that Tsunade had developed, temporary confusion rather than total deletion, allowing Mrs. Yamamoto to retain the emotional knowledge that someone had protected her while obscuring the supernatural details. She would remember being saved by quick-thinking shinobi rather than golden chains that materialized from thin air. But in her deepest heart, she would always carry the warmth of knowing that someone with the power of gods had chosen to use it to keep her safe. Hiruzen arrived at the secure facility within the hour, his aged face set in lines of cold fury that reminded everyone present why he had once been called the Professor and the God of Shinobi. Behind him walked Hinata Hyuga, summoned at Kakashi's request for her unique ability to monitor Naruto's divine energy fluctuations. "Report," the Hokage said simply. 3 root operatives conducted an unauthorized field test of Naruto's defensive capabilities, Kakashi said, handing over a mission scroll fragment that had been recovered from the captured bear operative. "Direct authorization from Danzo, though he'll deny it by morning." Hiruzen examined the scroll with the methodical attention of someone who had been reading battle reports since before most of his subordinates were born. The rage that built in his eyes was all the more terrifying for being completely controlled. "Root facilities Alpha and Beta will be shuttered by morning," he said quietly. 14 operatives will be reassigned to border patrol duty. Laboratory access will be restricted, and all research materials transferred to Anbu intelligence custody. He paused, looking down at Naruto's unconscious form with something that might have been parental concern mixed with the weight of impossible decisions. "And Kakashi, I'm approving your request for Team 7 assignment upon his graduation. This can't happen again." In the mindscape that existed somewhere between consciousness and dream, Naruto found himself standing in what looked like a massive sewer system. Water dripped from rusty pipes overhead, and the air smelled of dampness and confinement. But threaded through the architecture were filaments of golden light, divine energy made visible in this space between minds. At the end of the corridor, behind bars that could have contained a building, glowing red eyes regarded him with ancient intelligence. "So," a voice like grinding stone said, "you're the one who's been making all the noise upstairs." Naruto approached the cage slowly, noting how the golden threads seemed to weave around the bars rather than being blocked by them. Whatever power he carried, it operated on a different level than the seal that contained the nine-tailed fox. "You're Kurama," he said simply. It wasn't a question, somehow in this place he simply knew. The massive fox's ears twitched in what might have been amusement. "And you're the brat who's been carrying around the stench of divine authority like a badge of honor. Tell me, Kit, do you have any idea what you really are?" "I'm Naruto Uzumaki," he replied without hesitation. "And I'm going to be Hokage someday." "Hokage," Kurama repeated, and there was something almost like approval in his tone. "A leader who serves rather than rules. Interesting. Most beings who carry the power of gods eventually decide that mortals exist to worship them." "That's stupid," Naruto said flatly. "People aren't things. You don't get to own them just because you're strong." For a long moment, the fox studied him with those ancient eyes. Then slowly, Kurama lowered his massive head until it was level with the bars. "You know what, Kit? I think you and I might actually get along, but I've got one rule: no owner, no leash. I won't try to take over your body, and you don't try to suppress mine. We work together, or we don't work at all." Naruto considered this carefully. In the back of his mind, he could feel the weight of his instructor's lessons about bonds and partnership, about the difference between cooperation and domination. "Deal," he said, extending his hand toward the bars. "But if we're partners, then we protect each other, and we protect the people we care about." When Kurama's claw touched his palm through the bars, Naruto felt something shift in the deepest foundations of his being. Not dominance or submission, but recognition, 2 beings of immense power choosing to stand together rather than apart. "Partners," Kurama agreed. "This should be interesting." When Naruto woke in the medical facility, the first thing he saw was Hinata sitting beside his bed with a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Her Byakugan was active, monitoring the golden threads that wound through his system, and he could see her slight nod of relief as his energy patterns stabilized. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough from exhaustion. 6 hours, she replied softly. "The medics say you're recovering faster than expected. The breathing techniques are helping regulate the energy flow." Naruto pushed himself up to a sitting position, noting that the suppression weights felt different again, looser, but also more responsive to his conscious control. Whatever had happened during the attack, it had changed something fundamental in his relationship with the divine power. "Hinata-chan," he said carefully, "what you saw tonight with the chains, golden ropes that protected someone who needed protection," she said firmly. "That's all anyone needs to know." In that moment, Naruto understood that his friendship with Hinata Hyuga was going to be one of the most important relationships of his life. Not because she could see his power, but because she chose to see his heart first. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled then, the first truly unguarded expression he'd ever seen from her. "Partners help each other," she said. "That's what partners do." Outside the facility window, dawn was breaking over Konoha, and in the distance, Naruto could see Anbu operatives beginning their day shifts. The sunlight protocol would continue, The suppression seals would be recalibrated, and life would go on under the careful watch of those who understood the weight of the power he carried. But in the deepest parts of his mind, where divine authority met human choice, Naruto Uzumaki made himself a promise. He would never use this power to rule over others, no matter how much easier it might make his life. Bonds first, always bonds. The chains that could bind gods would be used to protect people instead. The bell test was supposed to be a formality. At 12 years old, Naruto stood in training ground 7 with his newly assigned teammates, watching Kakashi Hatake explain the rules of an exercise that would determine whether they became a real Genin team or returned to the academy in failure. The silver-haired Jonin's visible eye crinkled with what might have been amusement as he gestured to the 2 small bells hanging from his belt. "Your task is simple," Kakashi said lazily. "Take these bells from me before noon. Those who fail to get a bell go back to the academy." Sakura Haruno shifted nervously beside him, pink hair catching the morning sunlight as she calculated odds and strategies with the methodical precision that made her the academy's top theoretical student. On his other side, Sasuke Uchiha stood with the controlled stillness of someone who had never failed at anything in his life and didn't intend to start now. But Naruto barely heard the standard explanation. His attention was focused on the subtle wrongness in Kakashi's posture. The way the man's visible eye occasionally flicked toward the tree line where Anbu operatives waited in concealment. This wasn't the normal bell test. This was an assessment designed specifically for a student who carried enough power to level city blocks if he lost control. The suppression seals had been recalibrated again 3 days ago, their microscopic formulas responding to his improving mastery with graduated resistance. But beneath the familiar weight, the divine energy stirred restlessly, as if it sensed the importance of this moment. "You have until noon," Kakashi continued, "and I suggest you come at me with the intent to kill, or you'll never succeed." His single eye fixed on Naruto for just a moment longer than necessary, and in that glance was a wealth of unspoken communication. "Show me your control, show me you can work with a team, show me that 2 years of training have been worth the risk. Begin." 47 minutes passed in careful observation. While Sasuke and Sakura launched into their individual attempts with the confidence of academy graduates, Naruto melted into the forest with the patience of someone who had learned the hard way that power without wisdom was destruction waiting to happen. He moved through the undergrowth with movements that were too fluid for a fresh genin, too precise for someone who hadn't yet learned to kill. From his concealed position 30 meters upwind, he watched Kakashi counter Sasuke's fire style with casual efficiency, noted the subtle way the Jonin always maintained at least 2 escape routes, cataloged the rhythm of his breathing and the microtells that preceded each major technique. It was reconnaissance that would have impressed a Chunin-level operative, performed by a boy who was supposed to be learning basic teamwork. "This is wrong," Naruto thought as he observed his instructor's combat patterns. "He's not trying to teach us teamwork. He's testing something else entirely." The realization crystallized when he saw Kakashi's eye track toward the tree line again, toward the Anbu operatives who were watching this routine examination with the intensity of people expecting something significant to happen. This wasn't about bells or academy failures. This was about whether Naruto Uzumaki could function as part of a team despite carrying enough divine authority to break the world. Show him cooperation, not domination, Naruto decided. Show him that the power serves the bonds, not the other way around. When he finally moved, it was to create an opening for his teammates rather than claim victory for himself. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While Sasuke engaged Kakashi directly with taijutsu combinations that showcased Uchiha clan training, Naruto emerged from concealment on the Jonin's blind side, not to attack, but to force a defensive repositioning that would place their instructor within range of Sakura's prepared wire trap. It required split-second timing, perfect coordination with teammates he barely knew, and the kind of tactical sacrifice that put the team's success above individual glory. It also required threading divine energy through his movements with surgical precision, enhancing his speed and reaction time just enough to match Kakashi's repositioning without overwhelming the engagement with godlike power. The enhancement lasted exactly 3.7 seconds, well within safe parameters, but long enough for Kakashi to notice the subtle golden shimmer that accompanied Naruto's movements. Long enough to demonstrate that 2 years of training had produced not just control, but the wisdom to use that control in service of others. Sasuke's strike forced Kakashi left. Naruto's positioning forced him forward. Sakura's wire trap caught his ankle for exactly the half-second needed for Sasuke to reach for the bells. They didn't succeed, of course. Kakashi was an elite jonin with decades of combat experience, and 3 fresh academy graduates were hardly a match for him under normal circumstances. But for one brilliant moment, they had moved as a unit, each member's individual strengths supporting the collective goal. And that, Naruto realized as he watched Kakashi's visible eye crinkle with genuine approval, had been the real test all along. Interesting, their instructor said mildly, examining the wire that had briefly ensnared his leg. Someone actually read the situation correctly. Care to explain your reasoning, Naruto? The bells don't matter, Naruto replied, accepting the hand Sasuke offered to help him up from where he'd landed after his enhancement wore off. Teamwork does. You wanted to see if we could work together instead of competing with each other. And the enhancement you used during the final approach, Kakashi asked carefully. Naruto exchanged glances with his teammates, noting Sasuke's calculating expression and Sakura's scientific curiosity. They deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as security protocols allowed. I've been learning to channel chakra more precisely, he said simply. Iruka-sensei taught me breathing techniques that help with control. Sometimes I can push my physical capabilities a little beyond normal limits for short periods. It was true, if not complete. But it was honest in the ways that mattered. He had learned control, he was using that control to support his team, and he understood the responsibility that came with power. Kakashi studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Team 7 passes. Report tomorrow for your first D-rank mission. As they walked back toward the village, Naruto felt a familiar warmth in his chest, not the dangerous heat of uncontrolled divine energy, but the simple human pleasure of belonging somewhere. For the first time since his power had awakened, he was part of something larger than himself. Behind them, hidden in the trees, Anbu operatives began filing their reports. The assessment had been successful. Naruto Uzumaki could function as part of a team structure without letting divine authority corrupt his judgment or relationships. Phase 1 of his integration into active shinobi duty was complete. 3 weeks later, Team 7 received their first C-rank mission. Escort duty, Kakashi explained as they gathered in the mission assignment office. A bridge builder named Tazuna needs safe passage back to Wave Country. Standard procedure, protect the client from bandits and wild animals, nothing more dangerous than that. Naruto caught the subtle emphasis on standard procedure and the way Kakashi's eye flicked toward him when he mentioned danger levels. After 3 weeks of D-rank missions that had tested their coordination under gradually increasing stress, this felt like the next phase of whatever long-term assessment their instructor was conducting. Tazuna himself was a grizzled man in his 60s with the calloused hands of someone who had spent decades working with stone and steel. He looked the team over with the skeptical expression of someone who had hired professional protection and been given children instead. "These brats are supposed to keep me safe," he grumbled. "The blonde one looks like he can barely tie his own shoes." "Hey," Naruto protested, but Kakashi's raised hand cut off any further complaints. "My team is fully qualified for C-rank escort missions," their instructor said mildly, "and I assure you that appearances can be deceiving." More than you know, Naruto thought, feeling the suppression seal's pulse against his skin in rhythm with his heartbeat. The divine energy had been unusually restless lately, as if it sensed approaching danger. During their last training session, he'd managed to maintain a controlled enhancement for nearly 90 seconds without overextension, a significant improvement that both excited and worried him. The journey to Wave Country began peacefully enough. They traveled at civilian pace through the forests of Fire Country, with Kakashi maintaining a casual demeanor that didn't fool Naruto for a second. Their instructor's visible eye constantly scanned the surrounding terrain, and twice Naruto caught glimpses of Anbu operatives shadowing their group at a discreet distance. Definitely not a standard C-rank, he concluded. His suspicions were confirmed on the second day when they encountered the Demon Brothers. The attack came without warning as they crossed a wooden bridge over a mountain stream. 2 missing nin emerged from concealment in the support beams below, their clawed gauntlets gleaming as they struck upward through the planks at Kakashi's position. The Jonin's apparent death lasted exactly long enough for Naruto to experience a surge of rage that threatened to overwhelm every lesson in restraint he'd learned over the past 2 years. Divine energy flared along his chakra pathways as protective instincts screamed at him to manifest spectral chains, to tear apart the attackers who had dared to harm someone he cared about. Then training reasserted itself. 4-count inhale, 6-count exhale. Assessment before action. Team coordination over individual response. The enhancement he channeled into his movements was controlled and precise, lasting just long enough to intercept the second attacker's strike at Tazuna while Sasuke handled the first. But instead of overwhelming force, he used surgical redirection. A palm strike to the elbow that hyperextended the joint just enough to disable without permanent damage, followed by a leg sweep that put his opponent on the ground in a position where Sakura could apply pressure point techniques to ensure unconsciousness. Teamwork, always teamwork. When Kakashi emerged from his hiding place in the trees, alive and smugly satisfied with their performance under pressure, Naruto felt a familiar mixture of relief and irritation. Substitution jutsu, their instructor explained cheerfully. I wanted to see how you'd respond to apparent loss of command structure. You wanted to see if I'd lose control, Naruto corrected, noting the way Kakashi's eye tracked the fading golden shimmer around his hands. This was another test. Everything is a test, Kakashi replied seriously. Power without discipline is just destruction waiting for an excuse, but power with discipline. He gestured to where Sasuke was helping Sakura secure the unconscious missing nin. That can protect the people who matter. As they continued toward Wave Country, Tazuna finally explained the true nature of their mission. The bridge he was building represented hope for his people, but it also threatened the economic stranglehold that Gato's shipping company held over the region. Missing Nin had already tried to stop the construction, and worse threats were certainly coming. You should have been honest from the beginning, Kakashi said mildly. This is clearly an A-rank mission. I didn't have the money for an A-rank, Tazuna replied defensively. And I figured, well, ninja are ninja, right? You're all supposed to be superhuman anyway. Naruto felt something cold settle in his stomach at those words, superhuman. It was the kind of thinking that led to worship and fear, to the belief that power made someone fundamentally different from the people they were supposed to protect. We're not superhuman, he said quietly. We're just people who learn to fight. The only difference between us and you is training and circumstance. Tazuna stared at him for a moment, then laughed, a bitter sound with little humor in it. Kid, I've seen ninja do things that definitely weren't human. Trust me on that. As they approached the fog-shrouded waters of Wave Country, Naruto wondered if the old man was right. And if he was, what did that make someone who carried the power of gods in a human body? He was about to find out. The encounter with Zabuza Momochi came like a force of nature made manifest. One moment they were traveling through the morning mist in a hired boat, listening to their guide explain the economic situation in Wave Country. The next, the fog had thickened impossibly, and a voice like grinding stone was speaking from everywhere and nowhere. Kakashi of the Sharingan, how fortunate, I get to kill a legend. The killing intent hit them like a physical force, 847 units of pure, concentrated menace that made the air itself seem to vibrate with malevolent pressure. Sakura and Tazuna went white and began to shake. Sasuke's hand moved instinctively toward his kunai pouch, his body preparing to fight or flee from a threat his conscious mind couldn't fully process. But for Naruto, the killing intent triggered something deeper and more dangerous than fear. Weapon mastery echoes began to activate without his conscious control, divine energy responding to the threat with memories that belonged to a god of war who had fought titans and Olympians alike. For a terrifying moment, his awareness expanded beyond his 12-year-old understanding of combat, accessing tactical knowledge that spanned millennia of conflict. No, he thought desperately, falling back on every technique Iruka had taught him. Human responses, human choices. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, not whatever else I might be. The breathing exercises saved him. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, maintaining focus on his teammates' safety rather than the enemy's destruction. When Zabuza's executioner blade came whistling out of the mist toward Tazuna's neck, Naruto responded with carefully controlled enhancement rather than overwhelming divine force. The spectral chain that intercepted the massive weapon lasted exactly 2.3 seconds, long enough to deflect the strike, short enough to avoid catastrophic coil scorching. But in those brief moments, everyone on the boat saw what Naruto was capable of when pushed to his limits. The chain was translucent gold and moved with intelligence that suggested conscious control rather than mere chakra construct. It wrapped around the executioner blade's handle with precision that spoke of supernatural awareness, then yanked the weapon off its trajectory with strength that sent ripples through the water around their boat. Interesting, Zabuza said from somewhere in the mist. The brat has some unusual techniques. this might actually be entertaining. But before the missing nin could capitalize on Naruto's momentary exhaustion, Kakashi was moving. The Sharingan spun to life in his left eye as he began the hand seals for Water Dragon Jutsu. And suddenly the battle was between two Jonin-level opponents, while the Genin tried to keep their client safe. The fight that followed was a masterclass in high-level shinobi combat, with techniques that reshaped the local geography and water manipulation on a scale that defied normal understanding of chakra usage. But for Naruto, still dealing with the aftereffects of divine manifestation, it was also a lesson in the difference between power and skill. Zabuza was monstrously strong and incredibly fast, with enough raw capability to fight Kakashi on equal terms. But he was also predictable in the way that most missing nin were, reliant on overwhelming force rather than tactical innovation, expecting his reputation to do half the work before the battle even began. Kakashi, by contrast, was fighting with the methodical precision of someone who understood that winning meant protecting his team as much as defeating his enemy. Every technique he used was calculated not just for maximum effectiveness against Zabuza, but for minimum collateral damage to the Genin under his protection. That's what I need to learn, Naruto realized as he watched his instructor match their opponent technique for technique. Not just how to be powerful, but how to be powerful responsibly. The revelation came just in time for the arrival of Zabuza's partner. Haku appeared like a ghost made of ice and sorrow, senbone needles, finding their mark with medical precision that put the demon of the mist into an apparent death state. The boy and Naruto could see now that beneath the Hunter-nin mask, their opponent was probably close to his own age, moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to kill without hatred. "Thank you for your assistance," Haku said politely to Team 7, gathering Zabuza's body with the clinical efficiency of a professional cleanup specialist. "I have been tracking this criminal for some time." But Naruto's enhanced senses, still partially active from his earlier manifestation, caught details that his teammates missed. The slight tremor in Haku's hands as he lifted Zabuza's apparently lifeless form. The precise placement of the senbone needles, locations that would induce temporary paralysis rather than death. The way the boy's chakra signature carried the weight of reluctant devotion rather than righteous satisfaction. He's not really dead, Naruto realized, and this isn't really over. Kakashi seemed to reach the same conclusion, though his visible eye gave away nothing as he deactivated his Sharingan and helped his exhausted students back to the boat. "We'll continue to Tazuna's home," he said quietly. "But everyone stays alert. Something about this situation doesn't feel finished." As they traveled deeper into wave country, Naruto found himself thinking about the boy in the Hunter-nin mask. There had been something familiar in Haku's movements, a particular quality of restrained power that reminded him uncomfortably of his own struggles with control and limitation. "He's like me," Naruto thought. "Someone trying to use dangerous abilities to protect the people he cares about." The realization would prove more significant than he could have imagined when they met again on the bridge that Tazuna was building. A bridge that was rapidly becoming the focal point for a conflict that would test everything Naruto had learned about power, restraint, and the bonds that made life worth protecting. In the distance, fog rolled across the water like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of battles yet to come. 7 months had passed since the wave mission, and Naruto barely recognized the boy who had first manifested spectral chains in a moment of desperate protection. At 13, he stood taller and carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who had learned to balance impossible power with human responsibility. The suppression seals had been completely replaced 3 weeks ago, their simple weight-based design insufficient for his growing mastery. Today marked the beginning of something far more sophisticated. Jiraiya of the Sannin, the white-haired man introduced himself with a theatrical flourish that made Naruto wonder if all legendary ninja were secretly dramatic. "I'll be conducting your 14-day evaluation and implementing some upgrades to your current control systems." They stood in training ground 44, the Forest of Death, which had been cleared of its usual deadly inhabitants and converted into a secure facility for the assessment. Medical monitoring equipment surrounded a raised platform where 347 seal points had been arranged in a precise Fibonacci spiral pattern, each one glowing faintly with chakra-reactive crystals. "The cooling lattice," Jiraiya explained, gesturing to the elaborate array. "Your current suppression weights are like trying to cool a forge with ice cubes. This system will regulate your divine energy in real time, synchronized to your cardiac rhythm and neural activity patterns." Hiruzen stood nearby with Kakashi, both men wearing expressions of careful attention. The past 7 months had seen steady improvement in Naruto's control, but also concerning signs that his power was continuing to grow. The incident 3 weeks ago, when he'd accidentally manifested chains during a nightmare and carved foot-deep grooves in his dormitory wall, had accelerated the timeline for more sophisticated containment. "Will it hurt?" Naruto asked, eyeing the complex seal array with the wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of anything involving his unusual abilities. "About as much as getting a really elaborate tattoo," Jiraiya said cheerfully. "But the alternative is coil scorching on a scale that could put you in a medical coma for months. Your choice, kid." As Naruto settled onto the platform and felt the first seal points activate against his skin, Jiraiya began explaining the theoretical framework that would govern his training for the foreseeable future. "Divine energy," the Sannin said, pulling out a scroll covered in diagrams and formulas, "isn't actually chakra at all. It's what we're classifying as higher dimensional energy, something that exists on a different plane but can interface with our reality under specific conditions." The cooling lattice pulsed as it synchronized with Naruto's heartbeat, each point finding its rhythm like instruments in an orchestra. The sensation was strange but not unpleasant, like having a second heartbeat made of light running through his chakra network. "The threefold gate concept," Jiraiya continued, sketching on the ground with a piece of charcoal. "Gate 1, physical and spiritual integration, your normal chakra system. Gate 2, nature harmony, what you'll eventually learn as Sage Mode. Gate 3, divine overlay, your inherited abilities. The critical rule is sequential activation only, never simultaneous, never reverse order." "What happens if I mix them?" Naruto asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Catastrophic system feedback," Kakashi answered grimly. "We tested it with shadow clones. The results were educational." Over the next 2 weeks, Naruto learned to navigate his abilities with scientific precision rather than instinctive control. Jiraiya's training methodology was comprehensive and methodical, testing every aspect of his divine energy manifestation while the cooling lattice prevented dangerous overheating. The spectral chains, he discovered, could be maintained for up to 90 seconds at low intensity, 30 seconds at combat effectiveness, or 10 seconds at maximum power before the system required rest. The War Aspect Cloak, a new technique that Jiraiya helped him develop, provided enhanced intent stabilization and precision control for up to 60 seconds, but carried a hard limit that would automatically shut down regardless of his conscious desires. "Think of it as a safety valve," Jiraiya explained during one of their evening theory sessions. "Better to have your enhancement cut out mid-technique than to spend 3 weeks in medical recovery." But perhaps more importantly, Naruto learned the philosophical framework that would guide his use of these abilities. The divine overlay served the person served the community, and the community deserved protection from both external threats and internal corruption. It was a balance that would be tested sooner than any of them expected. The announcement of the Chunin exams brought international attention that made everyone involved nervous for different reasons. For Hiruzen, it meant foreign dignitaries and their security details learning about Konoha's most sensitive secrets. For Kakashi, it meant Naruto's abilities would be scrutinized by intelligence operatives from 4 major villages. For Naruto, it meant the chance to prove that divine power could coexist with democratic values on the largest possible stage. The preliminaries went well, Kakashi reported to the assembled leadership 3 days before the finals. Naruto demonstrated excellent restraint and tactical awareness. No divine manifestations, no loss of control, no concerning indicators. "And the Hyuga observation?" Hiruzen asked, glancing at the report from Hinata's preliminary match. "Hinata approached him afterward with some intensity," Kakashi said carefully. She reported seeing golden threads running through his chakra network with her Byakugan. Hiashi logged the observation per clan protocols, but it shouldn't affect the finals unless someone specifically knows what to look for. What none of them mentioned, though it was noted in classified reports, was the brief encounter Naruto had experienced the week prior. Itachi Uchiha had approached him near the memorial stone, subjecting him to a limited genjutsu that probed not his combat abilities, but his sense of identity and self-control. "Power is a tool," the missing nin had said cryptically as his illusion dissolved. "The tool does not define the wielder. Remember that when the pressure becomes overwhelming." The words had stayed with Naruto through his preliminary match against Kiba, through the month of training that followed, and now as he stood in the arena facing Neji Hyuga with thousands of spectators watching from the stands. Fate, Neji said as they took their positions, his Byakugan active and tracking the golden threads that Hinata had first identified. You cannot escape what you were born to become, Uzumaki. That power you carry, it will corrupt you eventually, just as it has corrupted everyone else who wielded divine authority. I don't believe in fate, Naruto replied, settling into the fighting stance that Jiraiya had taught him. And I especially don't believe that power makes people evil. People make that choice themselves. The philosophical battle that followed was as important as the physical one. Each exchange of techniques carried the weight of opposing worldviews. Neiji's certainty that predetermined destiny controlled all outcomes. Naruto's conviction that conscious choice could overcome any circumstance. When Naruto finally activated the War Aspect Cloak, 47 seconds into their final engagement, it wasn't to overwhelm his opponent with superior force. Instead, the divine enhancement stabilized his intent and sharpened his precision, allowing him to target Neiji's chakra points with surgical accuracy that left the Hyuga genius unconscious, but unharmed. The golden aura that surrounded him during those crucial seconds was visible to every observer in the arena, but its restraint spoke louder than its power. Here was someone who could have ended the fight in moments, but chose instead to prove his point through controlled demonstration rather than destructive dominance. Victory, the referee announced, goes to Naruto Uzumaki. But Naruto barely heard the crowd's reaction. His attention was focused on Neji, who was looking up at him with something like wonder in his pale eyes. How? Neji asked quietly as medical ninja arrived to check his condition. Because I choose to be stronger than my power, Naruto replied, offering his hand to help his opponent stand. Every single day, I choose that. In the VIP section, foreign dignitaries leaned forward in their seats with expressions of intense interest. A Jinchuriki with additional abilities was significant enough, but one who demonstrated such controlled application under pressure represented both opportunity and threat on an international scale. Orochimaru, disguised as the fourth Kazekage, studied the residual energy patterns that lingered in the air where Naruto had manifested his enhancement. The waveform signature was unlike anything in his extensive research, not demonic like the Nine Tails, not natural like Sage Mode, but something that resonated with frequencies found only in the most ancient texts about gods and their abandoned children. Fascinating, he thought, already planning how to adjust his research priorities. The Sharingan can wait. This discovery could reshape everything we understand about the nature of power itself. The invasion would proceed as planned, but now it would serve a dual purpose. Destabilizing Konoha remained important, but acquiring samples of this new energy type had just become the highest priority objective. As the crowd began to disperse and the next match was announced, none of the observers realized they had just witnessed the public debut of abilities that would reshape the political landscape of the shinobi world. Naruto's demonstration of controlled divine authority had sent ripples through the intelligence networks of 5 nations, and the consequences of that attention were already being set in motion. In the shadows beneath the arena, plans were being finalized that would test not just Naruto's power, but his commitment to the principles he had just demonstrated before thousands of witnesses. The real examination was about to begin. The invasion began at dawn with the sound of explosions echoing across Konoha's skyline. Naruto jerked awake in his dormitory as the building shook around him, plastered dust raining from the ceiling and emergency sirens wailing in the distance. Through his window, he could see smoke rising from the direction of the arena, where the Chunin exams finals were scheduled to continue that morning. The cooling lattice across his torso pulsed frantically as his divine energy responded to the surge of adrenaline flooding his system. Attack, his mind registered with crystalline clarity. The village is under attack. He was dressed and moving toward the door when the full implications hit him. Sasuke had been acting strangely for weeks, growing more distant and obsessed with power after his encounter with Orochimaru during the Forest of Death. If the village was in chaos, if there was an opportunity to seek strength elsewhere, the thought made Naruto's blood run cold. 20 minutes later, his worst fears were confirmed. He left with the Sound 4 during the initial assault, Shikamaru reported to the hastily assembled retrieval team. Akamaru tracked their scent to the north gate before losing the trail in the smoke from the burning market district. Around them, Konoha was transforming from a peaceful hidden village into a war zone. Anbu operatives moved in coordinated formations through streets filled with fleeing civilians, while medical ninja established triage centers in every available building. The invasion had been repelled, barely, but the cost was written in the faces of everyone around them. Hiruzen Sarutobi was dead. The third Hokage had given his life to stop Orochimaru's assault, using the Reaper Death Seal in a final act of sacrifice that had saved the village but left them leaderless in their moment of greatest vulnerability. The political implications would take months to resolve, but the personal impact hit Naruto like a physical blow to the chest. The closest thing he'd had to a grandfather was gone, and Sasuke, his teammate, his rival, his closest friend, had chosen that moment of chaos to abandon everything they'd built together. "We leave in 10 minutes, Kakashi said grimly, checking his equipment with the mechanical precision of someone forcing himself to function through grief. "This is a retrieval mission, not a combat operation. We bring Sasuke back alive and unharmed." But as they leaped through the trees in pursuit of the Sound Four, Naruto could feel something darker than determination building in his chest. The divine energy that he'd worked so hard to control was resonating with emotions that belonged to another lifetime. Memories of betrayal and abandonment that carried the bitter weight of godhood corrupted by loss. Kratos had trusted the gods once, had served them faithfully, believing in their wisdom and justice. Until they had used him, manipulated him, cost him everything that mattered, just like Sasuke was doing now. The cooling lattice was struggling to regulate the energy building in his system, its Fibonacci spiral pattern flashing warning colors as divine overlay levels climbed beyond safe parameters. By the time they caught up with the Sound Four at the Valley of the End, Naruto's control was hanging by the thinnest of threads. The battle on the statues of Hashirama and Madara became a collision between two kinds of power that had never been meant to coexist in the same space. Sasuke stood on Madara's head with the second level of his cursed seal active, demonic chakra wreathing his body like black flames, while his Sharingan spun with malevolent purpose. The power radiating from him was corruption made manifest, strength built on hatred, fueled by the desire to destroy rather than protect. Naruto faced him from Hashirama's statue with 67% of his divine overlay active, golden energy crackling around him in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But where Sasuke's transformation spoke of dominance and destruction, Naruto's enhancement carried the weight of desperate protection. He wasn't here to conquer his former teammate, he was here to save him, even if Sasuke didn't want to be saved. "You don't understand," Sasuke snarled, his voice distorted by the cursed seal's influence. "I need this power. I need to become strong enough to kill Itachi, strong enough that no one can ever hurt me again." "And what then?" Naruto shot back, fighting to keep his own transformation under control as the divine energy pressed against the boundaries of safe manifestation. "You kill your brother, you become the strongest. What happens to everyone else? What happens to Sakura, to Kakashi-sensei, to everyone who cares about you?" The philosophical divide between them had crystallized into something that could only be resolved through combat. Divine energy versus cursed seal, creation versus corruption, the bonds that connected people versus the isolation that consumed them. When they finally clashed at the center of the valley, the energy discharge was visible from 3 villages away. Divine and cursed chakra types weren't meant to interact directly. One was oriented toward creation and protection, the other toward consumption and destruction. When Naruto's spectral chains met Sasuke's Chidori at full power, the resulting feedback loop created a catastrophic energy discharge that permanently altered the geological structure of the Valley of the End. The blast radius extended 150 meters in every direction, carving new channels in the valley floor and sending seismic shockwaves through the surrounding mountain range. Trees that had stood for centuries were uprooted by the raw force of conflicting energy types trying to annihilate each other, and the air itself seemed to burn with residual power that would take months to fully dissipate. But more importantly, the collision shattered something deep in Naruto's psyche. With 89% divine overlay active and his emotional control demolished by betrayal and desperation, the barriers that separated his human consciousness from Kratos' memories began to crumble. For a terrifying handful of seconds, Naruto Uzumaki nearly disappeared entirely beneath the weight of divine authority that had once commanded the respect of gods and titans. "Kill him," the god of war whispered with grinding stone certainty. "He has chosen betrayal over loyalty, power over bonds. End this before he becomes a threat to others." Naruto's hand, wreathed in golden energy that could have carved through stone, drew back for a lethal strike that would have ended Sasuke's life in an instant. The power was there, the justification was clear, and the fury burning in his chest demanded satisfaction through violence. Then at the last possible moment, Itachi's words from weeks ago echoed through the rage. Power is a tool. The tool does not define the wielder. The divine strike arrested 0.3 seconds before impact, Naruto's conscious choice overriding both godly authority and human fury. Instead of delivering a killing blow, he channeled the energy into the stone beneath Sasuke's feet, creating a crater that immobilized without harming. "I won't kill you," he said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to something far older than 13 years. "I won't become the monster you think power makes people into." Sasuke stared up at him from the bottom of the crater, his cursed seal fading as the divine energy finally began to recede. For a moment, something that might have been recognition flickered in his dark eyes, an acknowledgement that Naruto had chosen restraint when overwhelming force was not just available, but justified. Then Kakashi arrived with the retrieval team, and the moment was lost in emergency medical protocols and damage assessment reports. The coil scorching was the worst anyone had ever seen. Level 4 severity, Tsunade reported to the assembled medical team as they worked frantically to stabilize Naruto's chakra system. Complete pathway shutdown, core temperature dysregulation, and neural pathway inflammation that could cause permanent damage if we don't get it under control in the next 6 hours. The enhanced lustral matrix that Sakura had helped design was already in place, its advanced cooling properties working overtime to prevent the divine energy from literally burning through Naruto's internal systems. But even with the most sophisticated medical techniques available, recovery would take weeks rather than days. Jiraiya stood beside the medical table with an expression of grim calculation, watching the cooling lattice struggle to regulate energy levels that had exceeded every safety parameter they'd established. The Fibonacci spiral pattern was flashing warning colors that indicated systematic failure across multiple regulatory nodes. "The lattice held longer than it should have," he said quietly to Kakashi, who was monitoring vital signs with the intensity of someone who blamed himself for everything that had gone wrong. 89% overlay should have killed him outright, the fact that he retained enough control to pull that final strike. "Doesn't matter if he doesn't survive the aftermath," Kakashi replied grimly. But Naruto did survive, though the 6-week recovery period that followed would test everyone's patience and resolve. For the first 2 weeks, he remained under constant medical supervision, his chakra capacity reduced by 30% and his body racked by occasional tremor episodes that left him barely able to hold a glass of water. The divine energy that had once felt like a warm presence in his chest was completely suppressed, leaving him feeling hollow and disconnected from the power that had become such an integral part of his identity. Worse than the physical symptoms, however, was the psychological integration event that began during his 3rd week of recovery. The extended period of reduced consciousness had allowed his subconscious mind to process the complete download of Kratos' memories that had been triggered during the Valley confrontation. For 14 days, Naruto experienced the full history of the god of war in vivid, inescapable detail. From his mortal life as a Spartan warrior to his ascension to godhood. From his manipulation by the Olympic pantheon to his ultimate quest for revenge against the beings who had destroyed his family. When he finally woke with full awareness, Naruto understood exactly what kind of power he carried and what it had cost the man who had wielded it before him. "How do you feel?" Hinata asked softly, her Byakugan monitoring the golden threads that were finally beginning to stabilize in his chakra network. "Like I've lived 1,000 years, Naruto replied honestly. "Like I've seen what power without wisdom can do to someone, and why every choice I make with these abilities matters more than I ever understood." The integration hadn't just given him access to Kratos' memories, it had provided the context to understand them. Power could corrupt, but it could also redeem. Strength could destroy, but it could also protect. The difference lay not in the abilities themselves, but in the character of the person who wielded them. It was a lesson that would define everything he did moving forward. The public relations crisis that followed the Valley incident required careful management from Tsunade, who had returned to assume the role of 5th Hokage in the aftermath of Hiruzen's sacrifice. 47 civilians had reported seeing a godly aura during the confrontation, and speculation about Naruto's true capabilities was spreading through Fire Country's newspapers faster than the official damage control efforts could contain it. The energy discharge had been detectable by sensors across 3 nations, and intelligence agencies were demanding explanations for phenomena that couldn't be classified using normal chakra-based theories. "We emphasize the guardian role," Tsunade explained to the assembled leadership during one of their weekly crisis management meetings. Community protection, defensive applications, strict oversight protocols. We acknowledge unusual capabilities while maintaining that they serve the village's interests rather than replacing democratic governance. The transparency policy was a calculated risk, revealing enough information to prevent wild speculation while maintaining operational security around the most sensitive details. Public opinion polls showed mixed results. 34% increased confidence in village security, 28% increased fear of uncontrolled power, and 38% waiting for more information before forming judgments. But perhaps more importantly, the incident had demonstrated that Naruto's power could be controlled even under the most extreme emotional pressure. He had chosen restraint when vengeance was justified, had preserved bonds when isolation would have been easier, and had proven that divine authority could coexist with human values even in moments of ultimate crisis. It was exactly the kind of precedent that would be needed for the challenges ahead. As Naruto's recovery entered its final phase and his divine energy began to stabilize at sustainable levels, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. "I want to leave the village," he announced during his final medical evaluation. "Not permanently, but for training that I can't do here without putting people at risk. I need to understand this power completely before I use it to protect anyone else." The decision was classified as a strategic exile rather than banishment, with Jiraiya designated as supervisor and full authority over the training regimen. It would be open-ended, based on controlled development milestones rather than arbitrary time limits, and designed to prepare Naruto for the kind of threats that normal shinobi training could never address. "You'll be missed," Hinata said quietly on the day of his departure, her pale eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and pride. "But you're making the right choice. Power like yours needs space to grow properly." As Naruto left Konoha with Jiraiya at his side, he carried with him not just the memories of a god of war, but the wisdom to understand why that god had ultimately chosen redemption over vengeance. The training journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but it was necessary preparation for the role he would eventually play in protecting not just his village, but the entire shinobi world from threats that hadn't yet revealed themselves. The exile wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the most important education of his life. Behind him, Konoha began the slow process of rebuilding under Tsunade's leadership, adapting their institutions to account for the reality of divine power operating within democratic frameworks. And ahead of him lay years of training that would transform him from a powerful but unstable force into the kind of leader the world would need when darker challenges emerged from the shadows. The rage of gods had been survived and channeled into wisdom. Now came the harder task of learning to use that wisdom responsibly. The road between fire and wind country stretched endlessly under the desert sun, and Naruto was beginning to understand why Jiraiya had insisted on traveling at civilian pace. This wasn't just a training journey. It was a systematic recalibration of everything he thought he knew about power, control, and the responsibilities that came with carrying the legacy of gods. Day 15, Jiraiya announced cheerfully as they made camp in the shadow of a massive rock formation that provided blessed relief from the heat. "How are the control katas feeling?" Naruto settled into the meditation pose that had become second nature over the past 2 weeks, feeling the cooling lattice pulse gently against his skin as he began the careful process of divine energy regulation. The Fibonacci spiral pattern had been recalibrated 3 times since leaving Konoha, each adjustment fine-tuning his ability to maintain stable enhancement without risking catastrophic overload. Different, he admitted, threading a thin filament of golden energy through his chakra pathways with surgical precision. "It's like, before, the power was this huge thing I had to wrestle with. Now it feels more like conversation." "Good analogy," Jiraiya said, settling beside him with his own meditation routine. "Divine energy isn't meant to be suppressed or dominated, it's meant to be integrated. The threefold gate system we've been working on is all about sequential harmony rather than conflicting forces." The training methodology they developed over the past months was unlike anything in traditional shinobi education. Morning hours were devoted to control exercises, precise manipulation of divine overlay percentages, sustained enhancement without overextension, and the delicate art of threading divine filaments through standard techniques to enhance rather than overwhelm their effectiveness. Afternoons were for practical application. Intelligence gathering in border towns, investigation of reported supernatural phenomena, and the kind of field experience that couldn't be replicated in controlled training environments. Naruto was learning to use his abilities not just in combat, but in the complex political and social situations that defined real shinobi work. Evenings were for theory and philosophy, the intellectual framework that would guide how he used these capabilities for the rest of his life. "The Ember Clone technique you've been developing," Jiraiya said, pulling out a scroll covered in notes and diagrams. "Show me the latest iteration." Naruto formed the familiar hand seal, but instead of channeling all his energy into a single powerful construct, he carefully distributed divine overlay across multiple shadow clones. The result was 5 duplicates, each carrying exactly 10% of his available enhancement, enough to be functional in combat or reconnaissance scenarios, but not so much that their dispersion would cause feedback damage. "Duration?" Jiraiya asked, timing the manifestation with the precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. 93 minutes at this load level," Naruto replied, monitoring the energy distribution with the kind of awareness that came from months of careful practice. "But I can push one clone to 20% for about 30 minutes if I need combat effectiveness." It was a far cry from the uncontrolled spectral chain manifestations of his academy years. The boy who had once scorched his chakra coils through emotional overreaction had been replaced by someone who could parcel out divine authority with mathematical precision, using exactly as much power as a situation required and no more. The philosophical discussions that accompanied their evening meals were equally important to his development. "Power serves people," Naruto recited the core principle that had been drilled into him since his first manifestation. "People serve community. Community deserves protection from both external threats and internal corruption." "And what does that mean in practical terms?" Jiraiya pressed, the same way he had every night for weeks. "It means I don't get to use this power just because I have it," Naruto replied, stirring their camp stew with the automatic motions of someone who had been having this conversation for months. "Every time I enhance or manifest, I have to justify it, not to myself but to the people who might be affected by my choices. And if you can't justify it, then I don't do it. Even if it would be easier, even if it would solve the problem faster, even if it would keep me safer. The power serves the purpose, not the other way around." It was a principle that would be tested sooner than either of them expected. The Jashin cult made their first move 3 weeks into the second month of training, during what should have been a routine investigation of reported artifact sites in the desert borderlands between Wind and Earth countries. Naruto was crouched beside a half-buried stone tablet, threading careful filaments of divine energy through the ancient symbols to test for resonance, when the attack came. 5 cultists emerged from concealment positions they'd probably been holding for hours, their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive planning and patience. "Divine corruption spreads its stain across the pure earth," their leader announced, drawing a curved blade that gleamed with an oily sheen that suggested poison or worse. "We will cleanse this abomination before it can spread further." The blood anchor sigils were already in place. Naruto could see them now that he knew what to look for, geometric patterns drawn in what was probably human blood, arranged in a precise formation around the archaeological site. If they'd been activated properly, his divine enhancements would be inverted into weaknesses, strength becoming fragility and speed becoming sluggishness. "Good thing Jiraiya taught me about disruption techniques," Naruto thought, even as his body moved through combat responses that had become instinctive through months of training. Instead of manifesting spectral chains or activating War Aspect Cloak, both of which would have provided overwhelming advantages, but also played directly into the cult's preparation. Naruto drew a kunai and relied on the enhanced reflexes and tactical awareness that came from careful divine filament integration. The fighting style that emerged was something entirely new in the shinobi world. Not the overwhelming force of divine manifestation, not the technical precision of traditional taijutsu, but a surgical blend of human technique, enhanced by just enough supernatural awareness to gain decisive advantages without crossing the line into godlike dominance. He moved between the cultists like water flowing around stones, each strike targeting nerve clusters and pressure points with accuracy that no normal 13-year-old should have possessed. But instead of crippling or killing his opponents, he aimed for disabling strikes that would end the fight without permanent damage. The blood anchor disruption came when he realized that the sigils required line-of-sight connection to function properly. A handful of smoke bombs and some creative repositioning broke the geometric pattern, causing the inversion effect to collapse and leaving the cultists with nothing but conventional weapons and religious fervor. Jiroya-sensei, Naruto called as he finished zip-tying the last of the unconscious cultists, I think we need to have a talk about organized opposition. The intelligence they gathered from the captured operatives was both valuable and disturbing. The Jashin cult wasn't just a collection of religious extremists. They were part of a growing movement that viewed divine energy users as existential threats to the natural order. They had training, resources, and most importantly, specific techniques designed to neutralize supernatural abilities. "This is bigger than we thought," Jiraiya said grimly as he reviewed the interrogation transcripts. "Cult membership across 3 countries, ritual sites prepared for mass ceremonies, and coordination with at least 2 other anti-divine factions we haven't identified yet." It was Naruto's first real glimpse of the enemies he would face in the years to come, not just powerful individuals, but organized movements with philosophical objections to his very existence. The Suna stabilization mission came 2 months later, when desperate communications from Temari reached them at a trading post just inside Wind Country's borders. Gaara was dying. The One Tail had been growing increasingly agitated over the past weeks, responding to some external stimulus that the Sand Village's medical corps couldn't identify or counteract. The Jinchuriki's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and traditional techniques for managing tailed beast relationships were proving inadequate. "He needs help from someone who understands what it's like," Temari explained when they reached Tsunagakure, her usual composure cracked by weeks of watching her youngest brother suffer. "Someone who's learned to work with their biju instead of just containing it." Naruto found Gaara in the medical facility, surrounded by monitoring equipment and looking frailer than someone his age should ever have to look. But more concerning than his physical condition was the aura of barely contained chaos that surrounded him. Shukaku's influence bleeding through the seal in ways that suggested the barrier between Jinchuriki and tailed beast was breaking down. "Hey," Naruto said quietly, settling beside the bed with the careful movements of someone who understood how dangerous the situation really was. "Rough week," Gaara's sand-rimmed eyes fixed on him with desperate intensity. "The voice won't stop, it keeps saying things about power, about what I should do to the people who fear me, about how much easier everything would be if I just let go." It was a conversation that could only happen between Jinchuriki, 2 people who carried the weight of beings that most humans couldn't even comprehend, let alone integrate into stable psychological frameworks. "Yeah," Naruto said simply, "I know that voice, but here's the thing I learned, it's not actually trying to corrupt you, it's trying to survive the only way it knows how." The next 12 minutes were perhaps the most important of Gaara's life. Naruto activated his divine overlay at exactly 8% intensity, enough to demonstrate controlled supernatural capability, not enough to trigger defensive responses from either Gaara or Shukaku. The golden aura that surrounded him wasn't intimidating or overwhelming. Instead, it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to bear great power without letting it define him. "This is what partnership looks like," he said, letting Gaara see not just the enhancement but the careful control that channeled it. "Not dominance, not submission, just working together towards something we both care about." Through their brief mental connection, Gaara experienced what it felt like to carry divine authority without being consumed by it. He felt the weight of responsibility, the constant choice between expedient power and ethical restraint, the way that true strength came from choosing to limit yourself for the sake of others. More importantly, he felt hope. The stabilization that followed wasn't dramatic or flashy. There was no explosive release of power, no moment of sudden transformation. Instead, Gaara simply settled. The chaotic aura around him calmed, his breathing became easier, and for the first time in weeks, Shukaku's voice quieted to a manageable whisper. "How?" he asked. "Same way you've been doing it," Naruto replied with a slight smile. "You just needed to remember that you're not alone in this." The diplomatic success of the mission extended far beyond Gaara's personal recovery. Sand Village formally endorsed Konoha's approach to divine energy management, establishing the first international precedent for cooperation rather than containment when dealing with supernatural threats. It was a small step, but an important one toward the kind of alliance system that would be necessary for the challenges ahead. The partnership formalization with Kurama came during their 3rd month of training, triggered by the success in helping Gaara but motivated by something deeper and more personal. "You know," the Ninetales said during one of their evening conversations in the Mindscape Forge Council that had replaced the old sewer imagery, "I've been thinking about what you did back there. With the Sand Kid." The mental space they shared had evolved considerably over the past months of cooperation. Gone were the prison bars and hostile architecture, replaced by something that looked more like a comfortable workshop where two individuals could plan and strategize together. "You didn't try to dominate his situation," Kurama continued, his massive form somehow less intimidating in this collaborative environment. "You didn't overwhelm Shukaku with superior power or force a solution through divine authority. You just showed them what partnership could look like. It's what you and I have been building," Naruto replied simply. "Why would I use a different approach with them?" For a long moment, the ancient Biju was quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice carried decades of accumulated wisdom and something that might have been gratitude. "No owner, no leash," he said formally. "That's our deal, Kit. Neither of us tries to control the other, and we work together to protect the things we've decided matter. Are you ready to make that partnership permanent?" "Partners," Naruto agreed, extending his hand toward the massive fox. "In everything from here forward." When their hands touched, flesh meeting spiritual construct in a space that existed between reality and dream, something fundamental shifted in the deepest foundations of Naruto's being. Not dominance or submission, but recognition. Two beings of immense power choosing to stand together rather than apart, each maintaining their individual identity while creating something stronger through cooperation. The enhanced capabilities that came from formal partnership weren't just about increased chakra reserves or improved battle coordination. They represented a new model for how disparate forces could work together without losing what made them unique, a principle that would prove crucial for the political challenges ahead. As their 18th month of training drew to a close, Naruto had transformed from a powerful but unstable force into someone who could serve as a bridge between the human and divine aspects of power. His control had improved to the point where he could maintain sustained enhancement for hours without risk, parcel out divine energy with mathematical precision, and coordinate multiple enhancement types without system conflicts. The Ember Clone technique had evolved into a versatile tool for reconnaissance, deception, and tactical support that multiplied his effectiveness without overwhelming his opponents. But more importantly, he had developed the philosophical framework and practical wisdom to use these abilities responsibly. Every manifestation was considered, every enhancement justified, every application of divine authority balanced against its potential consequences. "Time to go home," Jiraiya announced one morning as they stood on a hill overlooking Fire Country's borders. "You've learned everything this kind of training can teach you. The rest will come from real-world application and the kinds of challenges that only come from being part of a community again." As they walked toward Konoha, toward responsibilities and relationships that would test everything he'd learned during their wandering, Naruto carried with him not just increased power, but the wisdom to understand when not to use it. The training odyssey was complete. Now came the harder task of proving that divine authority could serve democratic values without corrupting them. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly under the setting sun. Ahead lay a village that was ready to welcome back not a weapon or a savior, but a citizen who happened to carry the power of gods and had chosen to use it in service of human bonds. The wandering was over. The real work was about to begin. The gates of Konoha looked exactly the same as they had 18 months ago, but Naruto knew with absolute certainty that everything else had changed. Not just the village, though he could sense the subtle alterations in chakra signatures and building layouts that spoke of reconstruction and growth, but himself. The boy who had left in voluntary exile had been replaced by someone who carried divine authority like a second skin, integrated so completely that it no longer felt like a foreign presence in his body. "Nervous?" Jiraiya asked as they approached the checkpoint where Kotetsu and Izumo were processing the morning's arrivals with their usual blend of boredom and professional competence. "About coming home." "No," Naruto replied honestly, feeling the cooling lattice pulse gently against his skin as it registered his elevated heart rate and automatically adjusted to compensate. "About whether everyone else is ready for who I've become." "Absolutely." The 18 months of training had transformed him in ways that went far beyond technical mastery of divine abilities. At 15, he stood taller and moved with the unconscious confidence of someone who had learned to balance impossible power with human responsibility. His blonde hair carried subtle golden highlights that became more pronounced when he channeled enhancement. and his blue eyes occasionally flickered with depths that suggested experiences no teenager should have accumulated. But more importantly, he had developed the philosophical framework and practical wisdom to serve as a bridge between human and divine aspects of power. Naruto Uzumaki, Kotetsu said with a grin as they reached the checkpoint, back from your extended training trip. How'd it go? Educational, Naruto replied simply, accepting the temporary visitor badge that would allow him access to the village pending his formal reintegration interview with the new Hokage. Is Tsunade-sama available for a meeting? She's expecting you, Izumo confirmed, stamping their travel documents with the efficiency of someone who had been briefed on their arrival timeline. Conference Room 7 in the administration building, 1400 hours. As they walked through the village streets toward their appointment, Naruto found himself cataloging the changes that had occurred during his absence. New construction projects that spoke of economic growth and population expansion. Modified Anbu patrol patterns that suggested enhanced security protocols. And underneath it all, a subtle shift in the way civilians moved and interacted that indicated confidence in their leadership and optimism about the future. Tsunade's been good for the village, he realized. They trust her in ways they never quite trusted the council system. The recognition brought with it a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern. He was glad his home had thrived during his absence, but he also understood that his return would disrupt the comfortable equilibrium that had been established. Divine energy users were inherently destabilizing forces, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully controlled. The fifth Hokage's office reflected its occupant's personality in ways that Hiruzen's never had. Where the old man had favored scholarly touches and philosophical reminders, Tsunade had created a space that spoke of decisive action and practical problem-solving. Medical techs shared shelf space with military strategy manuals, and the desk was organized with the efficiency of someone who preferred solutions to endless deliberation. Naruto, Tsunade said, looking up from a stack of reports with an expression that managed to combine genuine warmth with professional assessment. You look different. I feel different, he admitted, settling into the chair across from her desk, while Jiraiya took a position near the window where he could monitor both the conversation and the street outside. 18 months of intensive training will do that. Jiraiya's preliminary reports suggest the training was successful, she said, pulling a thick folder from her desk drawer. Divine energy manifestation controlled and purposeful, no coil-scorching incidents in the past 6 months, successful integration with both enhanced techniques and standard shinobi operations. But reports are one thing. Demonstration is another. The request wasn't unexpected. Of course, the village leadership would want to see proof that his extended training had produced results rather than simply delaying an inevitable crisis. But it was also the moment when his theoretical mastery would be tested against the political realities of democratic governance. What kind of demonstration? Naruto asked. Limited scope, controlled environment, full documentation for review by the Council and our international allies, Tsunade replied, consulting a detailed protocol document. We need to show that divine abilities can be deployed safely and proportionally, that they enhance rather than replace standard shinobi capabilities, and that they operate within established legal and ethical frameworks. 3 days later, Naruto stood in training ground 44, surrounded by the most comprehensive monitoring system ever assembled for a supernatural abilities assessment. Medical scanners tracked his vital signs in real time. Chakra sensors measured energy fluctuations across 17 different spectrums, and recording devices captured every detail for subsequent analysis by experts from 5 different villages. The audience was equally impressive. Tsunade and her advisory council occupied the primary observation platform, while representatives from Sand, Stone, Cloud, and Mist villages watched from a secondary viewing area that had been constructed specifically for this demonstration. Anbu operatives maintained perimeter security, but their positioning was designed more for crowd control than threat containment. A subtle but important distinction that acknowledged Naruto's status as citizen rather than weapon. The enhancement I'm about to demonstrate, Naruto announced to the assembled observers, is designed to provide tactical support and precision improvement rather than overwhelming force. Duration will be limited to safe parameters, and application will focus on protective rather than destructive capabilities. The war aspect cloak Vitwo that manifested around him was a significant evolution from the preliminary techniques he developed during the Chunin exams. The golden aura was more controlled and purposeful, providing intense stabilization and precision enhancement without the intimidating pressure that had characterized his earlier manifestations. At 12% divine overlay, it was powerful enough to demonstrate capability while remaining well within sustainable limits. For 43 seconds, Naruto moved through a complex training course that had been designed to test every aspect of enhanced performance. Target accuracy with thrown weapons, obstacle navigation under time pressure, civilian protection scenarios, and coordinated team exercises with volunteer Jonin partners. Each test was passed with precision that demonstrated supernatural capability while maintaining proportional response to the challenges presented. But perhaps more importantly, the demonstration showed restraint in action. Every technique was calibrated to achieve objectives without exceeding necessary force levels. Every enhancement was applied with surgical precision rather than overwhelming power, and every decision was made with visible consideration for collateral effects and civilian safety. When the cloak finally dissipated, and Naruto stood breathing heavily but clearly uninjured in the center of the training ground, the silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the civilian observers who had been allowed to witness the demonstration. Questions? Tsunade asked the assembled representatives. "The energy signature," said the Cloud Village observer, consulting notes that had been taken throughout the demonstration. "It's unlike anything we've previously cataloged. Not demonic like tailed beast chakra, not natural like sage mode. How do we classify this for intelligence purposes?" "Higher dimensional energy overlay," Jiroya replied from his position near the monitoring equipment. "We've developed a theoretical framework that treats it as a separate energy classification requiring specialized management protocols. Full documentation will be shared with allied villages as part of our transparency initiative." "And oversight?" asked the stone representative. "What prevents this capability from being used inappropriately?" Naruto answered before any of the Konoha leadership could respond. "The same thing that prevents any shinobi from using their abilities inappropriately: training, ethics, and community accountability. I'm not above the law because of what I can do. If anything, I'm held to higher standards because of the potential consequences of my choices." The discussions that followed extended through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, covering everything from tactical applications to political implications to the long-term effects of divine energy integration on village society. But by the time the formal assessment concluded, the consensus was clear. Naruto Uzumaki had successfully demonstrated that divine abilities could be controlled, proportional, and subordinate to democratic governance. The public address that evening was held in the same village square where Tsunade had announced her healthcare policies and economic development plans. But tonight, the crowd was larger and more diverse, including not just Konoha citizens but international observers, diplomatic representatives, and media correspondents from across the shinobi world. "Power," Naruto said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd thanks to amplification seals that had been integrated into the speaking platform, "is not about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do and who you choose to protect while making that choice." The speech that followed was both personal reflection and public commitment, a declaration of principles that would guide how he used divine abilities for the remainder of his life. He spoke about the lessons learned during 18 months of training, about the difference between authority and authoritarianism, about the responsibility that came with carrying power that could reshape the world. But more than that, he spoke about choice. The conscious decision to serve rather than rule, to protect rather than dominate, to strengthen democratic institutions rather than replace them with divine mandate. "I didn't choose to have these abilities," he said, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "but I do choose how to use them. Every day, every situation, every moment when power could provide an easy solution to a complex problem, I choose to be stronger than my abilities. To be human first, and divine only in service of human bonds." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, reflecting not just approval of his words but recognition of the maturity and restraint they represented. Here was someone who could have claimed authority through superior force, but had instead chosen to earn respect through demonstrated service. In the VIP section, foreign representatives leaned forward with expressions of intense interest and careful calculation. A Jinchuriki with additional abilities was concerning enough, but one who demonstrated such controlled integration with democratic values represented both unprecedented opportunity and significant strategic complexity. But perhaps more importantly, the address had achieved its primary objective. establishing Naruto's return not as the arrival of a weapon or savior, but as the homecoming of a citizen who happened to carry extraordinary capabilities and had proven himself worthy of the community's trust. The policy framework that emerged from the following weeks of discussion and debate became known as the Konoha Accords, a comprehensive document that would serve as the foundation for divine energy governance not just in Fire Country, but across the allied shinobi nations. The anti-worship clause explicitly rejected any attempt to treat divine energy users as objects of religious veneration or political authority beyond normal democratic processes. The limitation parameters established clear boundaries on when and how supernatural abilities could be deployed, with mandatory oversight for operations exceeding defined thresholds. The community integration sections emphasized service over dominance, with regular review and adjustment procedures to ensure that divine abilities strengthened rather than replaced existing institutions. But perhaps most importantly, the Accords established precedent for how extraordinary power could coexist with democratic governance without corrupting either. They created a framework that acknowledged the reality of divine energy while maintaining the supremacy of human choice and community consent. "It's not perfect," Tsunade admitted during one of their weekly policy review meetings, "but it's a start. And it's better than pretending these capabilities don't exist or trying to suppress them until they explode in ways we can't control." As Naruto settled back into village life, taking on missions that utilized his enhanced abilities while maintaining team coordination and civilian protection priorities, he found himself serving as a bridge between the human and divine aspects of power in ways that extended far beyond his individual capabilities. Young shinobi looked to him as an example of how strength could be channeled through service rather than dominance. International observers studied his integration model as a potential template for managing their own supernatural threats. And ordinary citizens gradually adjusted to the reality that their community now included someone who carried the power of gods and had chosen to use it for their protection rather than his elevation. The return was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Ahead lay challenges that would test not just his individual mastery, but the institutional frameworks and international alliances that had been built around the principle that power serves people rather than ruling them. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the political horizon as news of Konoha's successful divine energy integration spread to organizations and individuals who viewed such capabilities as existential threats to their vision of natural order. The Godslayer had returned home. His enemies were already moving to respond. The intelligence reports began arriving 2 weeks after Naruto's public reintegration ceremony, each one confirming what the village leadership had hoped to avoid but always knew was inevitable. His successful demonstration of controlled divine authority had accelerated every hostile timeline they'd been tracking. Jashin cult recruitment has increased by 400% across 7 countries, Shikamaru reported during the weekly threat assessment briefing, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had been working 18-hour days trying to track an exponentially expanding problem. They're calling him the divine corruption and using his existence as proof that the natural order is breaking down. Tsunade studied the intelligence summary with the methodical attention she'd once reserved for complex medical diagnoses, her fingers drumming against the conference table in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled frustration. Around the table, the department heads who made up Konoha's Crisis Management Council wore expressions that ranged from concern to outright alarm. "Military response?" Kakashi asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "Scattered across too many jurisdictions," Shikamaru replied, consulting a map that showed cult activity spreading like an infection across the continental shinobi world. "We're talking about small cells operating independently, unified by ideology but not command structure. Traditional counterinsurgency won't work here." From his position near the window, Naruto watched the morning training exercises in the courtyard below and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. At 16, he carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who had learned to balance impossible power with human accountability. But moments like this reminded him that every choice he made carried consequences that extended far beyond his personal sphere. "They're not wrong to be afraid," he said quietly, not turning from the window. "Divine power is dangerous. History is full of examples of what happens when people with godlike abilities decide that normal rules don't apply to them. But that's not what you're doing," Hinata said from her seat at the intelligence analysis station, her Byakugan active as she monitored the chakra signatures of everyone in the room. a precaution that had become standard during sensitive discussions. You've spent 3 years proving that divine authority can serve community rather than ruling it. To us, Naruto replied, finally turning to face the assembled leadership. To people who know me, who have seen the work I've put into control and restraint, but to someone whose entire worldview says that gods inevitably corrupt, my existence is an existential threat regardless of my intentions. The philosophical complexity of the situation was reflected in the diverse responses it had generated across the international community. Some villages were quietly reaching out to establish cooperation agreements, hoping to benefit from Konoha's expertise in divine energy management. Others were implementing containment protocols, preparing for the possibility that divine power users might emerge within their own populations. And a growing number were supporting groups that viewed such abilities as abominations requiring elimination. Which brings us to the more immediate problem, Tsunade said, pulling out a classified folder that had been delivered by Anbu courier that morning. Danzo, the name carried with it a familiar mixture of frustration and concern that had defined village politics for decades. Despite multiple attempts to curtail his operations, the Warhawk had proven remarkably adaptive at finding new sources of funding and influence when traditional channels were closed to him. Route budget reduced by 67%, 8 facilities shuttered, 34 operatives reassigned to standard duties. Kakashi recited from his position as Anbu commander. But intelligence suggests he shifted to external proxy networks rather than abandoning operations entirely. Black market artifact trafficking, Shikamaru added, consulting reports from their intelligence network. At least 12 divine relics have been moved through criminal networks in the past 6 months, with transaction patterns suggesting coordination with emerging warlord factions in the minor countries. The implications were deeply troubling. Danzo's access to resources meant that hostile factions weren't just growing in numbers. They were becoming equipped with tools specifically designed to counter divine abilities. The technological and tactical advantages that Naruto's power provided could be neutralized if enemies had sufficient preparation and appropriate countermeasures. How long before they're ready to move? Tsunade asked. Conservative estimate, 6 months before any single faction has the capability to pose a direct threat to the village, Shikamaru replied. But if they coordinate, 3 months, maybe less. The timeline concentrated everyone's attention on immediate rather than theoretical preparations. War planning shifted from abstract contingency to concrete operational necessity, with every department tasked to develop rapid response protocols for supernatural threats that had never been faced before. The formal training protocols that emerged from the crisis planning sessions represented the most comprehensive supernatural defense program ever attempted by a hidden village. Squad-level education, Kakashi announced to the assembled Jonin and Chunin leadership, mandatory for all active personnel, optional for civilian specialists who request clearance. 6 weeks of intensive instruction covering divine energy safety, emergency response, and team coordination with enhancement-capable operatives. The classroom sessions were conducted in the Academy's largest lecture hall, with Naruto serving as both instructor and live demonstration subject. The experience of teaching other shinobi about his abilities forced him to articulate concepts that had become intuitive through years of practice, translating visceral understanding into communicable knowledge. Divine energy manifestation creates a localized field effect, he explained to a group of 40 Chunin who were taking notes with the intensity of people whose lives might depend on understanding the material. Temperature variations, pressure changes, occasionally visual distortion. Your equipment will register these effects before you consciously notice them, so trust your instruments and maintain situational awareness. The practical exercises were equally important. Naruto would activate controlled enhancements while team members practiced coordination techniques, learning to function effectively alongside capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters without being overwhelmed or marginalized by the difference in power scales. The goal isn't to match my capabilities, he emphasized during one demonstration where a Chunin team successfully coordinated a complex rescue scenario while he provided tactical support through spectral chain manipulation. The goal is to find ways for my abilities to amplify your skills rather than replacing them. But perhaps most importantly, the training program established cultural precedent for how the village would adapt to the reality of divine energy integration. Instead of segregating supernatural capabilities or treating them as fundamentally different from standard shinobi techniques, The education framework emphasized cooperation and mutual support across different power levels. Enhancement doesn't make someone superhuman, Iruka observed during one of the instructional design meetings, his perspective as academy teacher bringing valuable insight to the curriculum development process. It makes them human with additional capabilities. The underlying person remains the same, with the same needs for friendship, purpose, and community belonging. The distinction would prove crucial for maintaining unit cohesion when the external threats finally materialized. The formal protocols for divine energy usage were codified into what became known as the Mantle Regulations, a comprehensive framework that balanced operational effectiveness with community safety and international diplomacy. Civilian zone protocols established absolute prohibition on divine manifestation without confirmed evacuation, with the sole exception being village-level threats requiring immediate intervention. The barrier requirements mandated minimum 3-layer containment systems for any planned enhancement activity, while surveillance provisions ensured that all divine energy usage was documented and reviewed for policy compliance. Stealth operation guidelines permitted microburst activation during classified missions, but limited duration to 15-second maximum intervals and required explicit command authorization for deployment. Intelligence applications had to demonstrate strategic importance sufficient to justify the risk exposure, while medical oversight protocols mandated health assessments before and after any covert enhancement usage. Combat deployment standards were the most complex, requiring real-time assessment of threat levels, civilian proximity, collateral damage potential, and international political implications before authorizing full manifestation. Command override authority was restricted to village-level leadership, with automatic review procedures triggered by any engagement exceeding defined parameters. It's bureaucracy, Naruto admitted during one of their weekly policy review sessions, but it's necessary bureaucracy. The alternative is people making decisions about divine power usage based on incomplete information and emotional pressure. The regulatory framework served multiple purposes beyond operational control. It demonstrated to international observers that Konoha took divine energy oversight seriously, provided legal protection for Naruto when his abilities were used appropriately, and established precedent that could be adapted by other villages facing similar challenges. But perhaps most importantly, the regulations reinforced the principle that had guided his development from the beginning. Divine authority operated within human institutions rather than replacing them. The reconciliation meeting with Sasuke took place on neutral ground, at the Valley of the End where their conflict had nearly destroyed them both 3 years earlier. The location was symbolic, a reminder of what happened when power was pursued without wisdom, when individual strength was prioritized over community bonds. "You look different," Sasuke observed as they stood on the restored statues of Hashirama and Madara, the stone showing subtle signs of the catastrophic energy discharge that had reshaped the valley during their last encounter. "I feel different," Naruto replied honestly. 3 years of learning that power isn't about what you can do, it's about what you choose not to do. The conversation that followed was philosophical rather than confrontational, two young men who had taken radically different approaches to extraordinary ability comparing the lessons they'd learned and the prices they'd paid. Sasuke's path had led him through darkness and isolation, ultimately teaching him the limits of individual excellence and the necessity of connection with others. Naruto's journey had emphasized restraint and service, proving that divine authority could strengthen rather than corrupt human bonds. "I still believe in precision," Sasuke said, his sharing in tracking the subtle golden threads that Hinata had taught him to recognize in Naruto's chakra network. Individual excellence pushing systems toward improvement. "But I've learned that excellence without purpose is just masturbation. And I've learned that community without strength is just wishful thinking," Naruto replied. "But strength has to serve something larger than itself, or it becomes its own form of corruption." They would never fully agree. Their philosophical differences were too fundamental, rooted in personality traits that no amount of shared experience could eliminate. But they had developed mutual respect and recognition that their approaches, while different, could be complementary rather than conflicting. "Collaborative opposition," they called it during their report to Tsunade. "We maintain ideological tension while enabling tactical cooperation. Neither approach is complete by itself, but together, they create a balance that serves the community's interests." The reconciliation established an important precedent for how democratic institutions could accommodate different perspectives on power usage without requiring philosophical uniformity or ideological submission. The intelligence reports that arrived during their fourth month of war preparation contained the confirmation everyone had been dreading. The three major threat factions had begun coordination efforts. Joint training exercises in neutral territory, Shikamaru reported during what had become daily threat briefings. Jashin cultists learning anti-technology techniques from the warlord faction, while Otsutsuki advanced scouts provide dimensional manipulation support for both groups. The strategic implications were sobering. Each faction alone posed manageable challenges. Religious extremism could be countered through education and superior organization. Conventional military threats could be addressed through alliance coordination. And advanced technology could be neutralized through tactical innovation. But working together, they represented a convergent threat that would test every system Konoha had developed for divine energy management. Timeline? Tsunade asked. 6 weeks, came the grim reply. Maybe 8 if we're lucky, and they spend time arguing about leadership structure. The final phase of war preparation began immediately, with every resource and capability the village possessed focused on the coming conflict. International allies were contacted and coordination agreements activated. Civil defense protocols were reviewed and updated. Emergency medical facilities were prepared for supernatural energy-related casualties. And through it all, Naruto found himself at the center of planning that acknowledged a difficult truth. The coming war would ultimately be won or lost based on how well he had learned to balance divine power with human values under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The sins of the father, the legacy of Kratos' rage and the corruption of divine authority, would be tested against the wisdom of the son who had chosen a different path. War was coming, and everything they had built would be put to the ultimate test. The war began at dawn with coordinated strikes across 3 fronts, each attack precisely timed to maximize chaos and prevent effective allied response. Naruto stood on the Hokage monument watching smoke rise from the village's southern district, where Jashin cultists had struck at civilian evacuation centers, while his enhanced senses tracked the dimensional distortions to the north that marked Otsutsuki scout activities. At 17, he carried himself with the absolute stillness of someone who had learned to channel divine authority through human wisdom. But the weight of simultaneous threats was testing every lesson in restraint and coordination he'd developed over the past 6 years. Initial casualty reports, Shikamaru said, appearing beside him with the systematic efficiency that had made him indispensable during crisis management. Jashin Ritual Complex. 17 civilians wounded, no fatalities thanks to the evacuation protocols. Relic Bearer Fortress. Siege conditions established, but they're holding defensive positions rather than advancing. Otsutsuki Dimensional Anchor. 3 square kilometers of reality distortion, but contained within the established perimeter. Coordinated but not overwhelming, Naruto observed, feeling the cooling lattice pulse against his skin as divine energy responded to combat stress. They want to stretch our resources thin rather than deliver decisive strikes. Which means they're building towards something bigger, Kakashi added, joining them on the monument with the tactical assessment reports that would guide their response strategy. All 3 factions showing unusual restraint. This feels like preparation rather than primary assault. The strategic challenge was unlike anything in recorded shinobi history. Traditional warfare doctrine assumed human opponents with conventional capabilities operating under predictable limitations. But the enemy coalition combined religious extremism with advanced technology and supernatural abilities, creating threat matrices that required entirely new approaches to combat coordination. Phased deployment, Naruto said, the decision crystallizing with the cold clarity that came from months of preparation and years of training. We address each faction sequentially rather than simultaneously. Concentrated force applied systematically instead of divided response across multiple fronts. Phase 1. Jashin Ritual Disruption, days 1-30. The assault on the cult's mountain stronghold required every lesson Naruto had learned about fighting enemies who specifically trained to counter divine abilities. The mass silence litany field that surrounded their complex could suppress supernatural enhancement across a 50-kilometer radius, forcing him to rely on conventional techniques enhanced by careful divine filament, threading rather than overwhelming manifestation. Tempo warfare, he explained to the assembled strike team as they prepared for the coordinated assault. We disrupt their ritual cadence through sensory overload rather than direct confrontation. Percussion techniques, visual interference, coordinated distractions that prevent them from maintaining the focused concentration their ceremonies require. The three-team formation that advanced on the cult's stronghold represented the pinnacle of alliance coordination. Team Alpha, led by Naruto with Kakashi and Sakura, focused on the central ritual site where the high priest was conducting what intelligence suggested was a mass purification ceremony. Team Beta, commanded by Shikamaru with Ino and Choji, handled communications disruption and strategic control of the mountain's access routes. Team Gamma, under Rock Lee's leadership with Neji and Tenten, maintained perimeter security and civilian evacuation coordination. The fighting that erupted across the mountain complex was unlike any previous engagement in Shinobi history. Instead of individual techniques clashing against individual opponents, it was systematic warfare designed to break the enemy's organizational capability rather than simply defeating their strongest fighters. Naruto moved through the cult's defensive positions like controlled lightning, his enhanced reflexes and tactical awareness allowing him to coordinate with his teammates while disrupting the geometric patterns that powered their anti-divine sigils. But instead of overwhelming force, he used surgical precision, strikes that disabled rather than destroyed, techniques that neutralized threats without permanent damage to opponents who were, ultimately, misguided civilians rather than enemy combatants. The Blood Anchor network is collapsing, Sakura reported through their communication system as she applied medical techniques that prevented cultist casualties while ensuring they remained unconscious. Whatever they were planning to channel through the mass ritual, it's not going to work without line-of-sight coordination. The collapse of the Jashin network's command structure took exactly 36 hours, with 89% of active membership surrendering or captured when their ideological framework was systematically dismantled through demonstration rather than destruction. More importantly, the intelligence gathered from their facilities provided comprehensive mapping of anti-divine religious movements across 7 countries. They genuinely believed they were saving the world, Naruto observed as he reviewed the interrogation transcripts and recovered documents. From their perspective, divine energy users are existential threats to natural order. Fear makes people do terrible things, but it doesn't make them evil. The distinction between evil and misguided would prove crucial for handling the more dangerous threats that followed. Phase 2, Relic Bearer Siege, days 35-60. The mountain fortress that had been constructed by the Warlord Coalition represented the most sophisticated anti-divine defensive system ever assembled. 67 entropy-laced artifacts created overlapping fields that could sever spectral constructs, disrupt chakra flow, and distort local reality in ways that made conventional assault tactics suicidal. Uzumaki's spiral technique, Naruto explained to the Alliance commanders during their pre-assault briefing, demonstrating the chakra pattern disruption method he developed specifically for this engagement. Instead of trying to overcome the entropy fields through superior power, we scramble their attunement frequencies through harmonic interference. The siege that followed lasted 25 days and established new paradigms for supernatural warfare. Rather than direct assault on the fortress complex, Alliance forces focused on political warfare and information operations that exposed the warlord's civilian abuse and forced recruitment practices to his own coalition members. 12 allied factions have withdrawn support, Tamari reported from Sand Village's Intelligence Coordination Center. Public exposure of civilian casualties and forced labor programs is causing internal political collapse faster than military pressure. But the most significant aspect of the siege was how Naruto's abilities were deployed. Instead of serving as the primary weapon system, his divine enhancements provided support for alliance coordination, enhanced communication during complex operations, tactical awareness for battlefield management, and the kind of morale stabilization that kept 12,000 allied troops functioning effectively under impossible stress. "This is what integration looks like," he said during one of their evening command briefings, his war aspect cloak providing just enough enhancement to coordinate simultaneous operations across 17 different engagement zones. "The power serves the strategy serves the people we're protecting." The fortress fell on day 26 when the warlord's remaining supporters abandoned their positions rather than continue a war that had lost all political justification. 89% of enemy artifacts were recovered or destroyed, 4.2 thousand former enemy troops were integrated into alliance protection systems, and 3 minor countries were liberated from hegemonic control. More importantly, the siege had demonstrated that divine energy users could be defeated through superior organization and democratic coordination rather than individual power contests. Phase 3. Otsutsuki Interdiction, days 65-90. The final confrontation came when accumulated divine energy signatures from the previous battles provided sufficient data for the advanced scout to establish dimensional lock-on coordinates. The battlefield that materialized in the forest north of Konoha was unlike anything in previous experience. Space-time distortions that made normal movement impossible, gravitational fields that behaved according to alien physics, and null sphere deployment that could erase constructs on contact. Triangulation deception, Naruto announced to the Alliance forces as they prepared for what intelligence suggested would be their most dangerous engagement. 47 Ember clones with varying divine loads create false targeting signatures, while natural energy masking prevents accurate lock-on. The combat coordination that emerged during the 3-hour engagement represented the absolute pinnacle of what democratic military organization could achieve against technologically superior opponents. Instead of individual power contests, it was systematic application of alliance capabilities designed to overwhelm advanced technology through superior numbers and tactical innovation. Naruto's role in the battle was precisely calibrated, enough divine manifestation to maintain enemy targeting focus, not enough to trigger catastrophic countermeasures. His spectral chains suffered 34% destruction during direct null sphere contact, but the temporary suppression created opportunities for Alliance forces to coordinate disruption of the dimensional anchor points that kept the scout tethered to local reality. Dimensional displacement successful, Shikamaru reported as reality stabilized around them and the alien technology began to fade from local spacetime. Scout neutralized, tech samples recovered, threat assessment data captured for future defensive research. The victory was significant not just for its immediate strategic impact, but for what it proved about coordinated response to superior individual power. Advanced technology that could have dominated any single opponent, no matter how powerful, had been defeated through systematic alliance coordination that maximized collective capabilities while minimizing individual risk exposure. Victory through democratic coordination. As the 3-month campaign concluded and alliance forces began the transition to reconstruction and integration phases, Naruto found himself reflecting on what the war had taught him about power, responsibility, and the relationship between individual ability and community strength. Standing once again on the Hokage monument, watching Konoha rebuild from conflict that had tested every system they'd developed over 6 years of careful preparation, he understood that the real victory hadn't been military, it had been philosophical. Divine authority can serve democratic values, he said during the Alliance leadership debrief that would shape international policy for decades to come, but only if it's systematically subordinated to collective decision-making and community accountability. The moment individual power becomes more important than institutional framework, everything we've built starts to decay. The comprehensive after-action reports that emerged from the war would become required reading in shinobi academies across all allied nations. They documented not just tactical lessons and strategic innovations, but the institutional frameworks that had enabled extraordinary power to strengthen rather than replace democratic governance. But perhaps most importantly, the war had established lasting precedent for how supernatural threats could be addressed through international cooperation rather than individual heroism. The alliance system that had defeated 3 coordinated factions remained in place as ongoing institutional framework, creating sustainable capacity for addressing future challenges that had not yet revealed themselves. The test passed, Kurama observed during one of their evening conversations in the Mindscape Forge Council that had become their collaborative planning space. You proved that gods can choose to serve people rather than ruling them, but staying on that path will be the work of a lifetime. As Reconstruction began and the Alliance transitioned from war footing to development partnerships, Naruto carried with him the knowledge that divine authority had been successfully integrated with human values under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The War of Gods and Shinobi was over. The harder work of building sustainable peace was just beginning. 23 years had passed since the divine awakening first stirred in a 7-year-old boy's dormitory. and Naruto Uzumaki stood before the graduating class of the Institute for Responsible Power Management, with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to carry the weight of gods without losing his essential humanity. At 25, he was no longer the desperate child who had scorched his chakra coils in a marketplace confrontation, nor the angry teenager who had nearly lost himself in divine rage at the Valley of the End. The man who faced these eager students carried himself with the integrated wisdom of someone who had successfully bridged the gap between human values and supernatural authority, creating something entirely new in the process. Power, he told the assembled class of 47 students, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had given this speech countless times but never allowed it to become routine, is not about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do and who you choose to protect while making that choice. The students, ranging in age from 16 to 22, representing 12 different countries and 6 distinct types of extraordinary abilities, took notes with the intensity of people who understood they were learning principles that would guide them for the rest of their lives. This was the Institute's 8th graduating class, and their diversity reflected how far the world had come in accepting and integrating supernatural capabilities within democratic frameworks. But more than that, Naruto continued, gesturing toward the wall where portraits of previous graduates hung alongside their current assignments. Power exists in relationship. Not the relationship between the powerful and the powerless, but the relationship between individuals who have chosen to use their capabilities in service of something larger than themselves. From her seat in the front row, Hinata watched her husband with the expression of someone who had witnessed his evolution from awkward boy to mature leader over 2 decades of shared growth. At 25, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had mastered not just divine energy modulation techniques, but the complex art of partnership with someone whose capabilities could reshape continents. Their marriage, now in its 3rd year, had become a symbol of how extraordinary power could coexist with normal human relationships, not through the domination of the stronger over the weaker, but through the conscious choice of equals who had decided to build something together that neither could achieve alone. The practical application, Naruto said, moving to the demonstration area where advanced training equipment had been set up for the final examination, is always secondary to the philosophical foundation. Technique serves purpose, never the other way around. The Institute for Responsible Power Management had grown from emergency necessity into the premier educational institution for supernatural ability training in the known world. Located on a 100-acre campus adjacent to Konoha proper, it accommodated 500 students across 4 age groups, with a faculty of 34 instructors including war veterans, divine energy specialists, and international exchange professors. Enrollment applications for next year, Shikamaru reported during their monthly administrative meeting. His role as education coordinator requiring him to balance academic standards with political necessity in ways that made his previous job as military strategist seem simple by comparison. 273 applications for 57 available slots. Selection criteria are holding steady, merit-based admission with socioeconomic diversity requirements. The curriculum that had evolved over 8 years of operation represented the most comprehensive approach to supernatural education ever attempted. The foundational level for younger students emphasized ethics before power, emotional regulation through breathing techniques, safety awareness, and social skills development that would enable healthy relationships regardless of capability levels. Intermediate levels introduced applied ethics through case study analysis, crisis management techniques, academic foundation subjects integrated with philosophical frameworks, and physical education programs that emphasized teamwork and cooperation across different power scales. Advanced students engaged in leadership studies focused on service-oriented models, technical skills appropriate to their specific abilities, cultural studies that provided international perspectives on power usage, and practical applications through supervised community service projects. The master level, reserved for students preparing for public service careers, included independent research projects, teaching assistance roles, professional preparation for specialized fields, and capstone experiences that demonstrated complete integration of technical ability with ethical reasoning. Graduation statistics, Hinata added from her position as Student Development Director, consulting reports that tracked alumni success across multiple metrics. 94% completion rate, 87% pursuing advanced community service positions, 73% entering public service careers after graduation. But perhaps more importantly than the statistics was the cultural impact the institute had achieved. Graduates were scattered across the international community in positions of responsibility and influence, serving as living examples of how extraordinary abilities could strengthen democratic institutions rather than replacing them. The theoretical framework that had emerged from 23 years of divine energy research and practical application was finally being codified into what would become the foundational text for supernatural governance across the allied nations. The Konoha principles, Naruto explained to the international academic consortium that had gathered to review the manuscript, established the philosophical foundation for integrating extraordinary capabilities with democratic values. But principles without practical implementation are just wishful thinking. The document that lay before the assembled scholars and policymakers was the result of collaborative effort involving researchers from 17 different institutions, field reports from supernatural ability users across 7 countries, and case studies from conflicts that had tested every theoretical assumption about power and responsibility. The first principle, power serves people, established the fundamental premise that extraordinary capabilities existed to strengthen communities rather than elevate individuals. This wasn't merely philosophical assertion but practical framework, with specific protocols for decision-making and accountability that prevented capability from becoming authority. The second principle, democratic integration, required that supernatural abilities operate within existing institutional frameworks rather than replacing them. Divine energy users, regardless of their power levels, remained subject to legal oversight, community accountability, and the same ethical standards that governed all citizens. The third principle, sustainable development, acknowledged that extraordinary capabilities would continue to emerge and evolve, requiring educational and institutional systems that could adapt without losing their foundational commitments to service and restraint. Implementation has proven more complex than theoretical development, admitted Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Stone Village's Research Institute, consulting notes from her own institution's attempts to adapt Konoha's model to different cultural contexts. Legal frameworks vary significantly between nations, as do cultural attitudes toward individual versus collective authority, which is why the principles focus on outcomes rather than methods, Naruto replied. Each community has to find its own way of ensuring that power serves people rather than dominating them. But the fundamental goal remains constant across all cultural variations. The academic discussion that followed extended through 3 days of intensive review, covering everything from practical enforcement mechanisms to theoretical edge cases that might challenge the framework's assumptions. But by the conclusion, the consensus was clear. The Konoha principles provided a viable template for managing extraordinary power within democratic societies. The marriage ceremony had taken place 5 years earlier in the same village square, where Naruto had first publicly demonstrated his commitment to community service over individual dominance. The symbolic significance wasn't lost on anyone. Here was someone who could have claimed authority through superior force, instead choosing partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Equal partnership, Naruto had said during his wedding vows, his words carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades learning the difference between power and authority. Not the strong protecting the weak, not the capable carrying the incapable, but 2 individuals choosing to build something together that neither could achieve alone. Hinata's response had been equally significant. Modulation is not control, it's cooperation. 2 different abilities working together to achieve shared goals while maintaining individual identity and choice. Their relationship had become a practical demonstration of how extraordinary capabilities could coexist with normal human bonds. Hinata's divine energy modulation techniques didn't suppress or control Naruto's abilities. They enhanced his precision and helped him maintain sustainable enhancement levels during extended operations. His spectral chains and war aspect cloak provided tactical support that amplified her analytical capabilities and sensory awareness. But more than the technical integration was the emotional balance they had achieved. Neither partner was required to diminish themselves to accommodate the other's capabilities. Instead, they had created a relationship framework where individual strengths supported collective goals while preserving the autonomy and dignity that made partnership possible. Professional coordination without personal subordination, Kakashi had observed during one of their annual relationship counseling sessions, a requirement for all couples where one or both partners carried extraordinary abilities. You've managed to avoid both the dominance dynamic and the worship dynamic that destroy most relationships involving significant power differentials. The counseling requirement wasn't merely bureaucratic oversight. It was practical necessity based on 23 years of evidence that supernatural abilities placed unique stresses on personal relationships. The Institute's Family Services Department had developed comprehensive support systems that helped couples navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of power integration, without sacrificing the intimacy and equality that healthy relationships required. The next generation was already emerging, and their capabilities suggested that divine energy integration was becoming a permanent feature of human development rather than a temporary anomaly. 17 confirmed cases in the past year, reported Dr. Sakura Haruna Uchiha from her position as Director of Supernatural Medical Research, consulting case files that represented the leading edge of human evolution, ranging from minimal enhancement capabilities to full manifestation potential, all responding well to early intervention and education protocols. The children born to parents with extraordinary abilities weren't automatically inheriting those same capabilities, but statistical analysis suggested higher probability rates than random chance could explain. More importantly, the children who did develop supernatural abilities were showing better integration and emotional stability than previous generations, evidence that environmental factors and early education could significantly impact how such capabilities developed. Cultural normalization, Naruto observed, watching through the window as children played in the Institute's recreation area, some using low-level enhancements for games of tag while others participated with standard human capabilities. They're growing up in an environment where extraordinary abilities are treated as normal variations rather than fundamental differences. The playground scene represented something unprecedented in human history. Children with vastly different capability levels playing together without hierarchy, competition, or fear dominating their interactions. The enhanced children weren't using their abilities to dominate the games, and the non-enhanced children weren't intimidated or excluded by capabilities they didn't possess. Integration from birth rather than adaptation after trauma, Hinata added, her Byakugan monitoring the children's energy patterns with the automatic awareness that had become second nature over 2 decades of working with supernatural abilities. They're developing emotional and social skills alongside technical capabilities instead of trying to retrofit human relationships to accommodate inhuman power. It was a development that suggested the future might avoid the conflicts and crises that had defined the first generation of divine energy users. These children were learning restraint and service as natural expressions of their abilities rather than hard-won lessons imposed after dangerous mistakes. The Global Impact Assessment conducted for the 20th anniversary of the Konoha Accords showed transformation on a scale that had seemed impossible during the early days of divine awakening. Conflict reduction statistics showed an 89% decrease in large-scale supernatural threats across the monitored regions, with most incidents resolved through diplomatic intervention and coordinated response rather than overwhelming force applications. The alliance system that had emerged from the three-faction war remained active as ongoing institutional framework, providing rapid response capability for emerging threats while maintaining democratic oversight and accountability. Educational spread had resulted in 23 nations implementing similar responsible power management programs, adapted to local cultural contexts but maintaining the core commitment to service over dominance. International exchange programs had created a shared community of supernatural ability users who viewed their capabilities as tools for global cooperation rather than national advantage. Diplomatic evolution had incorporated divine energy governance frameworks into international law, establishing precedents for how extraordinary power could be regulated without suppressing individual rights or community autonomy. The legal frameworks had proven adaptable to different political systems while maintaining their commitment to democratic accountability. Cultural influence extended beyond formal policy into art, literature, philosophy, and popular entertainment. The service before self principle had become a recognizable cultural touchstone, referenced in political speeches, religious services, academic conferences, and casual conversations across the international community. Social change on this scale typically requires multiple generations, observed Professor Iruka Umino from his position as Historical Analysis Department Head, comparing current developments to other major transitions in human civilization. But extraordinary circumstances apparently accelerate adoption timelines when the alternative is existential crisis. The acceleration hadn't been without costs. Political tensions, cultural conflicts, economic disruptions, and individual tragedies that marked every major transition in human social organization. But the overall trajectory showed sustainable progress toward integration rather than the collapse or authoritarian drift that early critics had predicted. As the sun set over Konoha and the day's classes concluded at the institute, Naruto found himself in the familiar position of evening reflection that had become a cornerstone of his personal discipline over 2 decades of growth and responsibility. The meditation garden behind the administrative building provided a quiet space where he could process the day's challenges while maintaining the careful balance between human awareness and divine capability that defined his existence. The cooling lattice that had once been essential for preventing catastrophic overload had long since been replaced by integrated regulation systems that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. At 25, he carried power that could reshape continents with the same casual competence that other people displayed in routine professional activities. The spectral chains that had once threatened to scorch his chakra coils could now be manifested for hours without fatigue. The war aspect cloak that had carried hard duration limits could be sustained indefinitely during normal operations. Enhanced physical capabilities, tactical awareness, sensory perception, and energy manipulation had become as natural as breathing. But more than technical mastery, he had achieved something that the original god of war had never managed: the integration of divine authority with human values in ways that strengthened both rather than corrupting either. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Hinata asked, settling beside him on the wooden bench that overlooked the training fields where tomorrow's students would continue learning the delicate balance between capability and responsibility. "Thinking grateful thoughts," he replied, taking her hand in his and feeling the familiar comfort of partnership that had sustained him through 2 decades of impossible challenges. 23 years ago, I was a scared kid who didn't understand what was happening to him. Now you're a slightly less scared adult who has figured out how to help other people understand what's happening to them," she finished with the gentle humor that had always been one of her most endearing qualities. Through the campus windows, they could see evening study groups working through ethical scenarios and technical exercises that would prepare them for careers in public service, international cooperation, academic research, and community leadership. Each student represented not just individual potential, but investment in a future where extraordinary capabilities served human flourishing rather than threatening it. In the distance, the lights of Konoha proper sparkled in the gathering darkness. A community that had grown from a hidden village, focused on military power, into a model for democratic governance that could accommodate citizens whose individual capabilities exceeded traditional human limitations. "The next generation will face challenges we can't imagine," Naruto said, watching the students through the windows as they worked on problems that would have been inconceivable during his own childhood. "But they'll face them with wisdom we never had access to and institutional support we had to build from nothing." "That's how progress works," Hinata replied, her Byakugan briefly active as she monitored the energy patterns of students practicing low-level enhancement techniques. "Each generation builds on what came before while adapting to challenges that are uniquely their own." As full darkness settled over the campus and the students gradually dispersed to their dormitories and evening activities, Naruto felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done and responsibilities properly discharged. The scared child who had first manifested spectral chains in desperate protection had grown into a leader whose example would guide extraordinary ability users for generations to come. The divine had been successfully integrated with the human. Power served people rather than dominating them. Institutions had proven stronger than individuals while still preserving the dignity and autonomy that made democratic participation meaningful. Most importantly, hope had replaced fear as the driving force for the future. In the quiet of the meditation garden, surrounded by the evidence of successful transformation and sustainable progress, Naruto Uzumaki smiled and prepared for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The god of war's legacy of rage and destruction had been transformed into something entirely different. A foundation for building rather than destroying, for serving rather than ruling, for growing rather than consuming. The new pantheon wasn't made of gods at all. It was made of people who had chosen to be worthy of the power they carried, and communities that had chosen to trust them with that responsibility. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and grounded in wisdom earned through 23 years of careful growth and conscious choice. The story was complete, but the work would continue for as long as there were people who needed protection and communities that deserved service. As it should be.
And so the God-Slayer found his redemption, not through conquest, but through service. The boy who inherited divine rage chose to forge it into hope. Hit that like and subscribe for more epic crossover adventures. Drop a comment below with your wildest what-if ideas. The world of possibilities is endless, and your suggestions could inspire the next incredible story. Thanks for joining this journey. Until next time, remember, true power serves something greater than itself.